The Marines are a colossal organization, and as the single greatest power in all of the One Piece planet, working your way up the ranks is not easy. Unless of course you have magical fruit power, then it becomes significantly easier. This is a concept I refer to as magical fruit nepotism. But for all of us regular fictional people, this is every Marine rank explained. And immediately after enlisting, a Marine is granted the rank of Chore Boy, with the only two canon Chore Boys we've seen being Kobe and Helmeppo after the events of Shellstown. As Chore Boy, your main responsibilities include scrubbing floors, scrubbing uniforms, scrubbing swords. Basically, if something needs a scrubbing, then them Chore Boys are getting a summoning. I guess if you want to look at it more positively, then Chore Boy is the 19th highest rank that you can hold within the Marines. But also, it's a bit of an exclusive rank because not all Marines are allowed to have it. And assumedly, this is due to in-world child labor laws because you can only be a Chore Boy if you enlist as a child, which I think makes sense. If you enlisted as an adult, then you'd be some sort of chore man. But as an adult, your first stop on the fun train that is military service is what I like to call the Seaman trilogy, which begins with the first installment of Seaman Recruit. Longtime channel watchers are probably expecting me to make a Seaman joke here, and don't worry, it's coming. But this is not a rank exclusive to One Piece fiction in general, or even the real-life Navy, because all of us at one stage were seamen. But the two most prominent in the One Piece world are Django and Fullbody. When Django enlisted due to his adultness, this was his starting point, and Fullbody was demoted to Seaman Recruit all the way from Lieutenant, so this is his second go at this trilogy. But once you've proved yourself as mildly adequate, you move on to Seaman Apprentice. And despite this rank existing, there is not a single known Marine we've met in the series who has held it, so instead, he is a dog. But capping off this extraordinary opening trilogy is Seaman First Class. It's another fairly obscure rank for One Piece. We know of exactly one character who is deemed worthy of being First Class, and he may or may not even still be a character. His name is Lines, and this was the guy who Gin shot and potentially murdered a Baratier. In the anime, you do see him crawling away afterwards, but in the manga, you do not see that. You see nothing at all. And in fact, legend has it that his body is still lying there at the Baratier entrance, decaying away to simultaneously greet and warn future customers. But if you manage to survive your time as Seaman First Class, then you are gifted with a brand new trilogy. You then get to graduate into the Petty Officer saga, featuring Petty Officer, Chief Petty Officer, and Master Chief Petty Officer. The first of which we have no examples of, so here's the dog again, but this time he's a bit more fancy. But for Chief Petty Officer, we have Asahija, a Marine who had his shadow stolen by the fiendish Gecko Moria, and his name literally means it's morning, which is one of the many examples of Oda naming his characters after the specific environments, times, or actions being committed by said characters in the one and only time they're shown. Meanwhile, Master Chief Petty Officer is the rank Tashiki held when we first met her, so this is where the Marines start being given a small taste of command power. And then, if you don't completely mess that up, then we are moving on upwards to Warrant Officer. And One Piece doesn't have any examples of these either, and I'm tired of using the dog. So I asked all of you to give me your original character Warrant Officer for one of my artists to draw, and we received this. His name is Mario. He always has a new conspiration theory that he believes religiously. He wears a red hat with his initial on it, so thank you very much for that completely original character idea. But I should say that even though we don't know any of them, Warrant Officer marks a big step up. The Marine organization is divided into two broad categories. You have the Infantry and Sailor Division, and above them are the Commissioned Officers, with Warrant Officer being the first of those ranks. And a step above that is Ensign, with notable ensigns including Marco, the Marine who was very, very upset that his squad were failing to capture the Straw Hats while they waited for Vivi's response at the end of Alabasta. He seems like a very minor character, and well, he is, but even then Oda remembered to include an image of Marco in his rookie days on the Film Z color spread. Should you be deemed worthy from there, a Marine will enter the Lieutenant trilogy, which commences with Lieutenant junior grade. And Rokaku, one of the first Marines we met in the series, holds this rank. Meanwhile, Fullbody was a full lieutenant until he decided to be a bit of a prick and got himself demoted. However, character development, because Fullbody post-time skip has worked his way back up and even further, now holding the rank of Lieutenant Commander along with Django and even Helmeppo, a trio of minor antagonists who have gone on their own respective redemption journeys. However, Lieutenant Commander still pales in comparison to the Commander, also known as just Commander, and quite famously Ripper is a commander, who became the leader of the Shellstown base after Axan Morgan was dethroned due to a series of events all revolving around a small girl and her rice balls. It's kind of like the domino effect meme. Rika makes a rice ball, which then ultimately leads to the toppling of a Marine dictator. We do have quite a few significantly more famous commanders though. Don Quixote Rocinante was a Marine commander, even during his time as a fake pirate, although sadly this fake fake pirate was still shot with a real bullet. In more recent times, Hibari holds this rank, and the non-canon fan favorite Condoriano is also a commander. That, or he was a member of the Straw Hats, I keep forgetting which. But from commander, we move to captain, and mate, we have lots of these. Captains play fairly integral roles in One Piece because this is the first big boy Marine position. When the bust call on any Sobi occurred, only Marines of captain rank and above were allowed to fight, with many of them capable of some pretty serious power, such as Shu, who destroyed one of Zoro's swords. Sharinguru and Very Good were also captains in any Sobi. One can become wheels and the other can become balls. It's all very fun. And as the title implies, captains are also often granted their own ships and a whole gaggle of Marines to command. This is the rank that Kobe and Toshigi currently hold, so you'd think the standards for this position would be pretty damn high. However, there's a however, because there's a big discrepancy with the exact requirements for the captain position. For example, Nezumi from the Arlong arc was a captain, and in retrospect, it seems like a questionably high position for him, considering that he has 0 combat ability. Or maybe it's just easier to get promoted in East Blue. And while we're here, Captain Nezumi is not to be confused with Captain Rattel, who is also a rat-based Marine captain who literally has the word rat in his name, because Nezumi is Japanese for rat, and rat is rat for rat. That aside, these are two completely different characters. Again, same rank, similar design, and practically the same name, but different characters. Maybe they're related, or maybe I'm just being rat racist. I don't know. So let's move on. Prove yourself as captain and you'll be upgraded to Commodore. And this is where things get fun, because the Commodore rank is where Marines start to gain very liberal uniform privileges. Most Marines below this rank have a very standard look. You do have your odd characters who stand out here and there, but along with the Commodore rank, you are granted a license to fashion. You have Commodore Brand New, who rocks up to work in a very fashionable black and blue button-up, a very lovely pattern that says, I take my job seriously, but I'm still a fun guy on the weekends, when I get them, which isn't often. Behind him on the runway, we've got Commodore Pudding Pudding, who wears an augmented marine coat with a neon green cravat, and who collects ponytails on his head. I say collects because when he was younger, he only had one. And then, of course, the Commodore you've all been waiting, for. It's Yarisugi of the G5 base. And there is no word in English, Elvish, Entish, or the tongues of men that can describe his sense of fashion. From the bottom up, we have golden knee-high metal greaves, aggressively guiding the eye to the bulge residing in Yarisugi's pink short shorts, contrasting against a spotted black and white top with a fur coat, a bow tie, and 3 star buttons because why not? He also once tried to kill Carabo by burning him at the stake like some sort of swamp witch. Commodores also start to be given very diverse assignments based on what it is they excel at. Commodore Brand New, for example, excels at paperwork, so his entire job is assigning and distributing bounty posters. Strength is not necessarily a factor to achieve this rank. It seems like you can be placed here if you're just really good at administration. But with those skills, this is as high as you can go. Because we're going to start using the A word now. Here we have the Admiral tier starting at the bottom with the Rear Admirals, one of which is Hina, and she even has her own subdivision within the Marines known as the Black Cage Corps, a sector of special forces under her control. What special things do they do? Don't know, it's never been explained. The 2 very recent Rear Admirals we met would be Prince Gru and Kujaku, which I find surprising because they seem incredibly young to have ranks this high up, and also Prince Gru has this ongoing rivalry with Kobe, which is a bit odd because he is 2 ranks higher than him. However, there's good reason for this, and I'll say the reason in a bit. But for now, it's also suspected that mysterious fan favorite Bogard is a Rear Admiral, mostly because he spends all of his time in the story standing behind Garp, hence the rear part. Explaining the jokes always makes them funnier, and also it's not even my joke. I quite blatantly stole it from a comment in my Bogard video. Meanwhile, it's difficult to say what his status is now, but one Diaz Drake was a Rear Admiral before he went undercover as a dinosaur pirate, and he's also captain of Sword, which is a whole thing of its own. Sword are a secret special force unit thing of the Marines who have resigned from the traditional command structure. So they're sort of like Schrodinger's Marines. They're both Marines and also not Marines at the same time. Traditional command turns a blind eye and allows Sword to just sort of do their own thing, which often means the freedom to act without bureaucracy. And if they mess up, then the Marines can officially say, oh, well, they weren't part of us. I had no idea this was going on. They were part of a different thing, being told what to do by a dinosaur. But this is also why Prince Gru has a rivalry with Kobe, because even though one is a Rear Admiral and one is a captain, both have effectively resigned those ranks and are equals within the Sword hierarchy. Officially speaking, even a chore boy holds a higher rank than any Sword member. But moving on, the 3rd highest rank within the Marines is of course the Vice Admiral. But despite being ever so high up and ever so difficult to attain, weirdly enough, it's also the most common Marine rank we encounter in the series. Not counting Marines who were promoted later, we've met 26 Vice Admirals in the series, which is more than, and I've got to get this right, more than all of the Lieutenant Commanders, regular commanders, captains, commodores, and rear admirals all combined. There's a lot of them. Vice admirals are generally stationed around the world and given command of the various G bases, such as Vice Admiral Smoker, who is leader of the G5 Marines. But we also do have Vice Admiral Commel of the G2 Marines, who had this whole subplot about coffee and how it always tastes bad, which was eventually solved when he was sold milk by Moda, and now his coffee tastes good, very good. Although since Emu destroyed the Lucia Kingdom, I'm assuming his coffee has gone back to tasting bad, very bad. But one of the factors that makes Buster calls so dangerous is because 5 Vice Admirals are assigned to them. On any slobby, this is where we met Doberman, Strawberry, Onigumu, Yamakashi, and my personal favorite Vice Admiral, Momonga. They're dangerous because Haki is a strict requirement to become a Vice Admiral. They must have a mastery of basic observation and armament. And in retrospect, the Straw Hats were very, very fortunate that they didn't engage with any of them during any slobby. The most famous Vice Admiral, though, is definitely Monkey D. Garp, who, despite him being arguably the most powerful Marine and its spiritual figurehead, chose to remain as merely a Vice Admiral. Chose, or I suppose choice being the key word here. Because in a way you could say that Vice Admirals have the highest degree of freedom within the Marines. Because becoming a full-on Admiral locks your nuts into a completely new command structure, which we'll get into in a bit. But Vice Admirals are of course next in line to become actual Admirals. For example, Gion and Tokikake were both Admiral candidates during the time skip, also known as Momo Usagi and Chaton, aka Pink Rabbit and Brown Pig. So they were even given preemptive Admiral epithets. So they're sort of like Admirals in waiting, or maybe Shadow Admirals. Yeah, that sounds cooler. Fun fact though, the man in charge of giving epithets is also a Vice Admiral. His name is Nazu Ketagari, and his hobby is fortune telling based entirely on people's names. And his name literally means to want to name someone. But moving on to the pinnacle now, we have the Admiral rank, a position which only 3 individuals at any given time can hold. Garp aside, Vice Admirals are nothing compared to every full Admiral we've ever met. The original 3 being Aokiji, Kizaru, and Akiinu, all 3 of which are code names assigned to them by Nazu Ketagari, their real names being Borsalino, Kuzan, and Sakazuki, which often leads to a lot of very confusing fan discussions, especially with the latter 2 because they aren't admirals anymore, so we don't use their code names anymore, but replacing them with Fujitora and Ryukugyu. 2 very interesting cases because they didn't go through the Marine hierarchy to get here. After the Paramount War, the world government conducted a global draft, and these 2 were seemingly promoted straight to Admiral. Straight from nothing to Admiral, which I guess is a pretty big FU to everyone who has served in the Marines for decades now. But it was necessary, because the emphasis of admirals is raw power. At any given time, these 3 figures are touted as the world government's greatest military might. These 3 people are supposed to command more fear than the hundreds of thousands of other Marines combined. Here's the thing though, due to this powersome reputation, admirals are under the direct command of the world nobles. And if a crime is committed against a world noble, an admiral is immediately sent to enact justice, such as when Luffy punched St. Charles on Sabari. Admiral Kizaru was immediately sent. Which seems like overkill, but that's the point. Because regular kill, or dare I say even underkill, rarely discourage rebellion. Hence why Garp refused the promotion, because he didn't want to be used that way. But from here, the single highest position one can reach within the Marines is the Fleet Admiral. But also not quite the highest, but also it is. And I'll explain why in a bit. But the Fleet Admiral is a rank assigned to only one person at any given time, and they are responsible for oversight across the entire organization and given sole command during wartime or battle scenarios. The thing about the Fleet Admiral is that, yes, it sounds all fancy and in charge, and you'd think that they have a lot of power, but they don't. What generally happens is the 5 Elder Stars make a decision, and then it's the Fleet Admiral's job to make those decisions work. And this is probably why current Fleet Admiral Sakazuki is often so frustrated. He reached what he thought was absolute authority, only to realize that he probably has even less agency than if he just remained an Admiral, or even a Vice Admiral. But, as alluded to before, we can still go one position higher. Above the Fleet Admiral is the World Government Commander-in-Chief. This is the very pinnacle of the hierarchy. The highest military position you can hold in this world. The Commander-in-Chief is responsible for not only overseeing the Marines, but every militaristic force that the world government controls, including Cypherpol. There's only ever one at any given time, and we only know of one at this point, who is Kong, a former Fleet Admiral, a very fascinating guy, and if you want to know more about him, then I would suggest that you definitely watch this video. But that is every rank within the Marines explained by a man on the internet. If I asked you who the greatest Marine in One Piece was, what would you tell me? You'd probably say Garp the hero. But let me ask you a question, another question. Who was Garp the hero before Garp the hero? Well, his name was, and still is, Kong, a former admiral, a former fleet admiral, and current commander-in-chief of the world government, holding a position second only to the 5 Elder Stars, and I suppose Emu, but shh, no one's supposed to know about him. Kong is a strange character, because his narrative role and his in-world role are completely disproportionate. When you take into account physical strength, as well as political and bureaucratic influence, Kong is potentially the single most powerful and influential human on the planet. And yet, in One Piece, he's appeared in a grand total of 3 pages across 2 chapters, one of which isn't even in the manga. One of them was Chapter 0, the Canon Strong World chapter tie-in. But as always in One Piece, we know much more about Kong than his time on screen would dictate, because it's very hard to keep quiet about someone of this massive legendary status. Kong was first fully shown to us in Chapter 594, Message, and he was introduced as the World Government Commander-in-Chief, a position previously unknown to us. Also, his office is massive. You don't really get the sheer scale of it until you see the wide panel, but if you look not at all carefully because it's huge, you will see Kong's aquarium, which features giant sharks, eels, a whale, and even a kraken. It's an office so large that only in manga could 2 people have a calm conversation, because in reality they would both need to yell from other sides of the room, which to be fair, Kong is very used to, as his first actual appearance was in Chapter 0. You can see him silhouetted yelling at Garp, a popular marine pastime, as Sengoku and Sakazuki would both go on to learn. Yelling at Garp is part of the Fleet Admiral job description, because at this time, 27 years ago, Kong was the Fleet Admiral. Although there is a slight translation issue, in Chapter 0 his position is translated only as Admiral instead of Fleet Admiral. However, it was later confirmed that he was indeed the Fleet Admiral, which leads to the pretty crazy question of just how old is Kong? And the answer is very. We can estimate Kong's age by the standard generational gap between Fleet Admirals. For example, our current angry boy in charge is Sakazuki, and he's 55. Meanwhile, the former much more calm boy in charge was Sengoku, who is 79, which is a year difference of many. With that same generation gap, we can estimate that Kong is potentially in his late 90s, if not over 100 years old, which is insane considering that he's still actively employed with the world government. And he looks pretty damn good for a 90-plus-year-old man in Chapter 594, but this isn't too unusual for One Piece. We do have abnormally old human characters like Dr. Kureha, who is allegedly 141 years old post-time skip. And Oda did say in the SBS of Volume 56 that the life expectancy of a normal human in this world is about 140, so with that in mind, Kong is practically just middle-aged. Now, I should say that other than Dr. Kureha, we have yet to meet another human who is over 100 years old, which would make Kong the second oldest known human in the series, with his biggest competition being Haradas, who is 99. If you don't remember him, he's the Witheria guy who always goes, oi, 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 oi. That guy. But to put age into some perspective, Dr. Vegapunk is only 65 years old. Roughly two-thirds of a Kong. So the path of a One Piece character seems to be spending about 50 years as a regular person and then living out another 90 years as a geriatric. Weird fact now though, we know that Kong's birthday is on May 9th. And that's important because May 9th is Goku Day in Japan. This is because the date 5/9 can be read as Goku. So it became Goku Day in honor of Dragon Ball. Goku notably being an alien monkey, and Kong is one in a long line of primate-based characters in One Piece, including one marine literally named Gorilla, because Oda loves his monkeys even when they're also dragons. But Kong's ability to greedily hoard units of age makes him a fascinating character, because it means that he comes from an era of One Piece that we know shockingly little about. Assuming he signed up in his early 20s, a rookie Kong would have been a marine 80 years ago, roughly around the same time when Sengoku, Garp, and even Goldie Roger were born. He lived in a world before the birth of its greatest heroes and its greatest villains. And weirdly enough, the most we know about what was going on in the world at the time comes from the isolated nation of Wano. Kozuki Sukiyaki was born, the Kurozumi clan lost power, and their systematic purge began. As for what was happening outside of Wano, ironically, complete mystery, meaning that Kong belongs to a largely unknown and practically ancient generation of Marines. Garp, Sengoku, and Suru all joined the Marines around the same time, which was 56 years ago when they were in their early 20s. And this would place Kong in his late 30s, early 40s at the time of their enlistment, meaning that by now a man with his innate gifts would have worked his way to the top. We're talking Rear Admiral or even Vice Admiral rank, maybe even Full Admiral, although the ages are a little bit inconsistent with the Marines. You can't always judge a career progression by age, because to have Vice Admirals like Smoker reaching that position as early as 34, but then 2 ranks below him at Commodore we have Brand New, who is 56. But to be fair, most of what Brand New does can be summed summed up by graphic design is my passion, because he assigns and prints all of the bounty posters. That's it, that's his full-time job, so Commodore may very well be his skill ceiling. But even for the very best, many Marines would end their career at the Vice Admiral level because the criteria and positions available to become an Admiral are incredibly harsh and scarce. But Kong was one of the rare few to rise above all and become one of the 3 Marine Admirals, together considered to be the greatest military might of the Marines. It's very likely that Kong had been promoted to Admiral by the time the God Valley incident took place, which was 38 years ago, and it meant that Kong was very much a leader during the most terrifying era this world has faced in recent history, which was the reign of the Rocks Pirates. By this point, Garp was 40 years old and almost certainly a Vice Admiral, and as powerful as Kong was/is, it definitely says a lot that ultimately it was Garp and Roger who had to bring Rocks down, as opposed to Kong and his 2 other Admiral counterparts at the time. Kong even makes this admission himself during one of his rare appearances where he says to Sengoku, "You two," referring to Sengoku and Garp, "have led the Navy since the days of Roger," actively admitting that even though he was an Admiral/Fleet Admiral, the true leaders of the Marines during a huge chunk of his time were Garp and Sengoku. His subordinates had eclipsed him. Skipping ahead to 27 years ago, the Battle of Ed War was when Kong was well into his tenure as a full-on Fleet Admiral, with established command over the single greatest power in the world, which means that he was 100% a Haki user. All Marines Vice Admiral and above need basic observation and armament mastery. However, Kong may very well have been a user of Conqueror's Haki as well, just as his successor Sengoku is, and Sakazuki may be. It's currently not confirmed, but I'd be very surprised if he wasn't. It really is a requirement to operate at the top levels of the world. There's also a question as to whether or not Kong was a Devil Fruit user, and at first, and I suppose only glance, he seems more along the lines of Garp, someone who has taken raw strength well beyond standard human limits. He could very well be a fruit user though. Muscles and magical fruit aren't mutually exclusive, but something that Kong is unlikely to get a lot of credit for in the fan base is his sheer intelligence, primarily because it's all obscured by his insanely thick with so many C's muscles. Being Fleet Admiral means having the ability to command complex battles and even extended wars. It also means being able to navigate politics to some degree, having a delicate approach to balancing the hundreds of world government nations' interests. So you don't give this role to the guy who just punches things really hard. What's more interesting to think about are who exactly were the 3 admirals working directly under Kong at the time. Well, of course, we have confirmation that one of the 3 was Kong's eventual successor, Sengoku the Buddha. He was an admiral when Shiki attacked Marineford, and depending on how you look at it, another candidate could be Black Arm Zephyr. He was the main antagonist of Film Z, and he was a couple of years younger than Sengoku, so he's about the right generation, and even though it's technically non-canon, he was a former admiral. The problem is that even if Zephyr was canon, his window as an admiral is very short. He became an admiral at age 38 and retired 4 years later after his wife and son were murdered. He then became an instructor during the exact year when Borsalino and Sakazuki joined the Marines. But timeline-wise, even if he was canon, Zephyr could not have been an admiral when Shiki attacked Marineford. So Sengoku had 2 mysterious strengths and unknown counterparts. It couldn't have been Borsalino, Sakazuki, or Kuzan, because all 3 of them were shown as vice admirals in more recent history. Kuzan and Sakazuki during the Ohara incident, and Borsalino was still a vice admiral up to at least 12 years ago when he defeated Arlong in the Fisher Tiger flashback. And while he's been brought up, fun fact, Kizaru and Kong have the same voice actor in Japanese. His name is Unsho Ishizuka, and he also voices Zoro's mentor Koshiro, so he's like the go-to old man actor, as opposed to Kong's English voice actor Jim Furonda, who also voices Barriette, so he's like your go-to monkey actor. However, Barriette in Japanese is voiced by Kappe Yamaguchi, who voices Usopp, who once shot Kizaru, who is voiced by Unsho Ishizuka, who also voices Kong, and there we go, we brought back things around Kong. Kong would eventually fade from global prominence though, and the popular thought is that Kong retired following the execution of Goldie Roger. I mean, what better time? You capture the world's greatest criminal and your career ends on a high. But that doesn't work for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's likely that Kong retained his position for well over a decade after Roger's execution, because Sengoku was still an admiral during the events of Minion Island in Law's flashback. So up until very recently in world history, Kong was the man in charge, and had been for anywhere between 2 to 3 decades. And the second reason why it's wrong is because Kong never retired, he was promoted. Because Fleet Admiral is not the pinnacle. At the very, very tippy top is the Commander-in-Chief, a position that is second only to the 5 Elders and I suppose Imu. Kong's Commander-in-Chief office is even located at the Holy Land of Marijois, thus making Kong one of the extremely rare non-world nobles allowed to live there who isn't a slave. I'd say that he may have been made a world noble or like an honorary world noble thanks to his century of service, but I get the feeling that it doesn't quite work like that. You either need the celestial bloods or you're nothing nothing to them. Nothing. Much like the Fleet Admiral, the Commander-in-Chief job is still to oversee the entirety of the Marines. However, this position now also includes oversight over Cypherpol, which the Fleet Admiral has no jurisdiction over. Basically, Kong is the man in charge of every armed force in the world government. And in the real world, that would also include things like the Air Force or the Army. But in the One Piece world, technology hasn't gone far enough to have an Air Force yet, and there isn't enough land in general to warrant a ground army. Prior to their dissolution, Kong also had theoretical direct authority over the 7 warlords. I say theoretical because, Kuma aside, no one could control them, and in fact, in the case of Doflamingo, he was the one controlling the world government. But that aside, the Commander-in-Chief position is primarily lots and lots of paperwork, because the more power you have, the more accountability you have, and so the more writing and signing and stamping that it is that you need to do. And assumedly, Kong still holds the Commander-in-Chief position to this very day, because when Sengoku retired, he was assigned the Inspector General role, which is in charge of investigating corruption within the Marines. And this may actually tell us a fair bit about the kind of man that Kong is, because the impression I get of him is that he was genuinely trying to help the world. He took great pride in the Marines, but not the sort of really extreme pride that Sakazuki does. Plus, he and Sengoku very much saw eye to eye. However, the fact that Kong lives at Marijois may demonstrate a higher level of tolerance or even appreciation of the world nobles that Garp, Sengoku, and even Sakazuki definitely do not have. And even though he is one of the most minor characters in the grand scheme of the story, he is still by far one of the most important people in the grand scheme of the world. Again, his narrative role is completely at odds with his in-world position. Currently, Kong is a more powerful man than Sakazuki. He is the pinnacle of progression with the Marine organization, having transcended them and becoming the closest a standard human can ever become to a world noble. And also, he has really cool hair. I'm loving the triple spikes and the matching beard. Mate, don't you even try to tell me that he isn't one of the most powerful characters in One Piece. Although if you do try to tell me, then try to tell me in the comments below, which I may or may not read. What makes a man great? Some men are born great, others have greatness thrust upon them. But one man simply clenched his fist and punched greatness repeatedly in its primarily conceptual face until it relinquished its greatness like lunch money to a bully. This is the story of a man respected by kings, tolerated by fleet admirals, and feared by donuts across the world because he will eat them. This is the story of the greatest Marine to have ever lived. So where does one even start with Monkey D. Garp? Well, he's one of the most important characters in the entire One Piece legendarium, and while he is known as Garp the hero, the truth behind this is murkier than the depths of Magellan's toilets, or as Magellan calls it, his special seat. But as with all heroes, Monkey D. Garp has humble beginnings, having been born in the peaceful East Blue Sea, Goa Kingdom to be precise, in the year that is 78 years before the year that it is now. And you know, it's amazing just how well known Goa Kingdom isn't, considering that the world's greatest hero and the world's greatest villain were both born there. Now, as a child, Garp enjoyed all of your standard activities. He enjoyed hunting for treasure, playing with loose pipes, and subduing weird bearded tigers so that he could ride them. Dressing in what I would personally describe as a hoon aesthetic. Hoon, translated from Australian, means loud and reckless. But this is certainly important because it tells us that Garp was almost certainly not born into the nobility of the Goa Kingdom. He was just another East Blue scrub. And take note here that Garp as a child has the trademark monkey eye accessory, as all monkey members feature either a scar or tattoo around their left eye. Although in Garp's case, the scar is a bit inconsistent because, well, Oda often just forgets to draw it. And as such, Garp has been depicted entirely scarless in the manga on no less than 25 different occasions. But Garp and his magical scar would then enlist in the Marines at age 22, which actually makes Garp something of a late bloomer considering that his 19-year-old grandson is now about to become the Pirate King. Alongside Garp, his two future best friendos also enlisted, Sengoku from South Blue and Suda from North Blue, thus completing the Naruto model of shonen protagonists with the 2 male, 1 female ratio. And together they had adventures, ever so many adventures, none of which we actually know about, but I have it on good authority that they did in fact happen. But as Garp rapidly climbed the ranks, he would also encounter his most profound rival, a young Goldie Roger, the man who would inevitably conquer the Grand Line and become the world's first Pirate King. That took a while though, like quite a while. And in the meantime, there was some big stuff that happened between now and then, or I suppose then and then. 18 years after Garp joined the Marines, the planet would face its greatest crisis. A pirate known as Rocksteezerbeck, in an event best described as somehow, formed the most powerful crew in history, and probably the future as well. This crew included Edward Newgate, Golden Lion Shiki, Charlotte Linlin, and even a very young Kaido. Together they were the Rocks Pirates, and they were unstoppable. Which was unfortunate because it was Garp's job to stop them. Rocks' mission was to cripple and usurp the world government, thus making himself the king of the world. And he would have done just that if not for this meddling marine. The critical moment that changed history forever occurred 38 years ago on an island called God Valley, an island that today has completely vanished. So we don't know exactly where in the world it is, but we've narrowed it down to somewhere around here. God Valley was likely a settlement of world nobles, upon which Rocks launched a brutal and merciless attack. However, standing in his way was an unlikely alliance of Monkey D. Garp and his pirate, some rival Goldie Roger. Together they fought and defeated Rocks, but I'm afraid that's all we know because the historical records of God Valley completely ceased there. The island vanished from reality, and nobody who actually witnessed it has yet been brave enough to reveal the mystery behind it. But it was probably this guy using this thing. In any case, Garp was awarded an award, and there was maybe a parade where all the Marines went, yay! And after defeating Rocks, Garp earned his epithet as the hero of the Marines. Which is interesting because not only was Roger's involvement covered up, but eventually the whole incident itself was covered up. Which means that the whole world accepts that Garp is a hero, but almost nobody knows exactly why. So I imagine that most conversations surrounding this topic go a little something like this. Hey, why exactly is Garp a hero? Because he just is, Steve. You fuck. But even though Rocks was defeated, the threat of piracy only increased from there. Garp's work was far from done as he chased pirates from point A to point B, and even assaulted one with a point E head. That was Don Chinjiao, by the way. And Garp smacking him in the old noggin would go on to directly trigger a series of events, whereby Chinjiao's grandson would go on to marry a literal bombshell. This is also where Garp would earn his second epithet, now becoming known as Garp the Fist. And look, as a pirate, I think the very last thing you want to hear is that you're being chased by a man known as the Fist. One of the more notorious pirates who managed to elude Garp during this time was Shaki, a former empress of Amazon Lily and alleged future wife of Dark King Silver's Ray Lee. I say alleged because it's vague and tricky and no one cares anyway. But the typical Garp-Shaki encounter went a little something like this. Halt, you evil bad person, for I am Garp the hero and you are Pirate the Zero. Surrender now or else I will do things. Nah. Damn it, she got me again. Despite that, Garp was a very successful Marine during this period. He was even promoted all of the way up to the rank of Vice Admiral and even offered the position of a full Admiral. However, he declined because Admirals are under the direct command of the world nobles and nobody wants to be commanded by this guy. Meanwhile, Bestie number 1 Sengoku did go full Admiral, whilst Bestie number 2 Suru also rose to become a Vice Admiral, primarily through her powers of being able to do like really good laundry. That's literally her devil fruit. She can turn her opponents into laundry and sort of like scrub the evil out of them. It sounds stupid, but it is surprisingly powerful. During this period, Garp's rivalry with Goldie Roger heavily amped up, and it's even been implied that Garp often had the upper hand over Roger, managing to corner him on numerous occasions, but Roger, much like a well-lubed otter, always managed to slip out of Garp's grasp. So I imagine that Garp was just as surprised as anyone when Roger voluntarily turned himself into the Marines. By this time, Roger had found the hidden island of Laugh Tale, become the Pirate King, achieved wealth, fame, and power and all of the other things, and seemingly decided just to throw it all away, because shortly thereafter he was scheduled to be publicly executed. As someone known as more of a global villain, Roger's encapsulation elicited a wide array of responses. Some people were thrilled, some people were distraught, and others were a bit of both, such as Rock's alumni Golden Lion Shiki. Shiki was the emotional equivalent of a black and gold party mix. Lots of variety, but all of them bad. And so he launched a one-man invasion of Marineford, fighting both Garp and Sengoku and destroying half of the Marine headquarters before finally being overcome. An event which to date still holds the title of greatest tantrum ever thrown in One Piece. Big Mom doesn't even come close. But prior to his execution, Garp would visit his rival in prison one last time, at which point he was hit with an unexpected proposition. Garp, my oldest friend. I'm not your friend, Roger. We've been through this. My friend, I need a friend favor. I need you to raise my child. I don't think that's a good idea, Roger. You're right, Garp. It's not a good idea. It's a great idea. Well, why didn't you say so before, you silly son of a D? I'll do it. I, Garp the hero, will become the world's greatest parent. Well, that didn't work out as planned. Alright, stop. Let's rewind there because I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Following Roger's execution and the birth of his son Ace, Garp adopted and/or commandeered the child, resulting in one of the most challenging experiences of both of their lives. Because try as he might, children were the first problem Garp had ever encountered that he could not solve with punches. But as a very busy Marineman, Garp had very little time for parenting anyway. So what he needed to do was find Ace a nice, warm, supportive, and nurturing environment. And so he blackmailed a group of mountain bandits, forcing forcing them to raise Ace within their criminal enterprise. And not only that, but eventually Garp also tossed his own grandson, Luffy, into the bandit household as well, practically ensuring that neither of them would ever become the strong, justice-driven Marines that Garp had hoped for. I legitimately wonder if Garp looks back on his life and goes, you know, I just don't know where I went wrong with them. Not to mention that Garp's other potential son, Monkey D. Dragon, was now in the midst of starting a global revolution against the world government and very potentially becoming the next Roxy Zebek. So the Parenthood scorecard is, well, it's not looking great. However, Garp did have the chance to redeem himself. In terms of series chronology, Garp was first introduced during the Diary of Kobe Meppo cover story, where he was charged with escorting Captain Morgan, who subsequently escaped. That's right, the second villain that Luffy ever beat managed to escape from Garp the hero. You know, I think that Garp just didn't care that day. Also, fun fact, during his cover story, Garp is introduced with a dog mask, and that was to hide his identity, because even though this was his first appearance in One Piece, he had previously appeared in the prototype series Romance Dawn version 2 as Luffy's grandfather. So for Oda to not give away that plot twist immediately, Garp needed to be shrouded in his fancy canine visage. Morgan, by the way, is still a free man to this very day, but during this story, Kobe and Helmeppo described what I suppose was very vaguely impressive marine-y qualities, because Garp decided to personally train both of them. And to his credit, this has been the most successful Garp parenting so far, because these two have done one hell of a glow-up. But back to unsuccessful parenting now. After becoming a big boy, Ace immediately set sail as a pirate, going on to pledge his undying loyalty to Edward Newgate and very much trying to Kill Bill his way to Blackbeard as a result of all of the bad things he'd done. Ace, of course, failed, was caught, and subsequently scheduled to be publicly executed just like his father. It was not the proudest moment of Garp's life, or Ace's life, or anyone's life. Apart from Sakazuki, that dude, he had a really good day that day. Garp, however, was caught in quite a rough place. Ace's capture had effectively commenced a war against Whitebeard, and Garp had to face the choice of letting his grandson die for the greater good, or saving him and potentially dooming the world into unknown anarchy. So despite being on the battlefield in the ensuing Paramount War, Garp spent most of his time just sitting and contemplating, which did give us probably Garp's most famous quote, "I have no pity for criminals, but family is a different story." Having said that, this is a case of a parallel narrative, because the criminal story and the family story pretty much had the exact same ending. As eventually the die of fate were cast, and Ace was cast in to die on the battlefield by Sakazuki, which was a very convoluted way of saying he was killed. After which point Garp had to be restrained by bestie Sengoku, or else Garp was prepared to murder Sakazuki himself. The Marine Admiral had blasted a hole clean through Ace's chest, which leads to the inappropriately timed Garp fun fact of the video, as according to the anime, Garp once seriously attempted to break the world record for donut eating. In this effort, Garp consumed 842 donuts without eating or sleeping, but was still unsuccessful in being awarded the record. Meanwhile, many speculate that the actual donut eating record is held by this man. And that was your inappropriately timed Garp fun fact of the video. But seriously, Ace's death destroyed Garp. And after more than half a century of service, Garp would retire from active duty. However, he retained his rank and agreed to stay with the Marines in order to train the next generation. However, the more accurate story is that Garp, well, he wasn't really allowed to retire, because losing the hero of the Marines would have such a psychological blow to the public as well as the planet as a whole. So these days, Garp spends much of his time with mermaid escorts. Sorry, I read that wrong. These days, Garp spends much of his time escorting mermaids to and from the Reverie. At one point, even crossing paths with Stelly, the new monarch of Garp's birthplace, the Goa Kingdom. Another one of those less than proud Garp moments, I'm sure. So what makes a man great? Yes, some men are born great, others have greatness thrust upon them, whereas some people just get nicknamed the Fist, and hey, I'm not about to tell a man named the Fist that he isn't great. That sounds like a not so great idea. But Garp the hero is someone who exists for the benefit of the world. The idea of an unbeatable hero is there to make people feel safe and have faith in the world government. But the reality of Garp is much more complicated. He's a man who has always done what he thought was the right thing to do. Whether it actually was or not is a different question altogether. And the only thing about Garp that is not open for interpretation is that this dude once ate an ass ton of donuts. What is the largest space that exists within the One Piece world? Well, there's a hole in the ocean that once held the Lucy Kingdom. That's a pretty big one. Just a giant void within the planet itself. There's also literal outer space. That's pretty big as well. Or the great space and time that is the Void Century. And you know what? I'd have to imagine that after giving birth to 85 children, the space between Charlotte Linland's legs may be one of the most cavernous voids in all of fictional existence. However, even with all of that in mind, there is no space larger than the sheer gap between the rank of admiral and vice admiral. There is a great imbalance within the Marines. It's a very top-heavy organization. At any given time, you have 3 individuals, any of whom are capable of standing one-on-one against an Emperor of the Sea, and up until recently have been godlike characters in One Piece who we have had no hope of standing against, and then directly one step below them are the vice admirals who historically have never had any hope of standing against anyone. Despite being the 3rd highest rank within the Marines, vice admirals have never been a problem, and that is a problem. Because Eiichiro Oda wants us to take them seriously. He wants us to feel fear and tension whenever they show up. However, due to his own actions as an author, Eiichiro Oda has made this impossible. And so vice admirals occupy this very, very awkward space in the story where the author wants you to expect something from them, but never delivers on that something. So at the moment, there's about 30 canon vice admirals in One Piece, and I think it would be quite a challenge for most fans to name 5 of them, because they're so disposable that they're usually not worth the brain space to remember. Let me give you an example. To me, this is a pretty perfect illustration of the space that vice admirals occupy in this series. In chapter 705, we are introduced to Vice Admiral Maynard the Pursuer, a man who is both introduced and defeated in the very same chapter. Maynard the Pursuer appears to fight battle and defeat Gambia, and then the next time we see him, Maynard is knocked out and lying in a pool of his own blood after being beaten up by Bartolomeo. This is why it's hard to remember their names, and why it's even more difficult to take Vice Admirals at all seriously. And later on in Dressrosa, this happens again, this time with Vice Admiral Bastille, who gets to fight Sabo for a page and a bit before he too is knocked out and lying in the now trademark Maynard Vice Admiral position of shame. So what's going on here? Well, if you're a Star Trek fan, then firstly, congratulations, good choice. But secondly, you may recognize this as something of a Worf effect. The Worf effect is named after Mr. Worf, a big scary Klingonman, who in theory is usually the most physically powerful and capable character in any given scene. But what happens is, for the writers to show that an enemy of the weak is a true threat, the first thing they have that threat do is defeat Worf. Only then can we as an audience take that threat seriously. But after happening so many times, it just gives you the impression that Worf really sucks at fighting, and that if anything, he's weaker than most of the humans aboard the Enterprise. Which is exactly what's happening in One Piece with the Vice Admirals. They serve as a Worf effect to make our protagonists feel fearsome, and so they often exist as podium characters. They are designed to elevate others. Like in Dressrosa, we have Vice Admirals who elevate Bartolomeo and Sabo quite well, but they do nothing for themselves. And that's not to downplay Bartolomeo and Sabo, especially Sabo. He's second in command of the Revolutionary Army. Arguably, a Vice Admiral just shouldn't be an issue for him. But it's when you keep consistently using Vice Admirals like this, the rank loses its power. It's no longer threatening or tension building to hear that a Vice Admiral is in the area, because we have no point of reference to actually view them as a problem. All it means is that someone's going to have to wash their hands soon due to all of the Vice Admiral blood that's about to be shed. Now look, I don't blame the next two for this, but during Marineford, Vice Admiral John Giant and Lons were both podiums for Whitebeard, and fair enough because he was the strongest man in the world, but it's more indicative that Vice Admirals are really only here to serve as a staircase for other characters. And what's worse is that it never seems to matter how many Vice Admirals there are. You could have 100, even 1,000, maybe even 100,000 of them, and the outcome would still be the same. During the Gyre arc, we get our first scene featuring multiple Vice Admirals. Their names are Mozambia, Stainless, and Cancer, but you may remember them better as the guy who was being controlled by Doflamingo, the guy who was being attacked, and the guy who was just sitting there watching it all happen. All it took was one Flamingo casually using his abilities to render 3 Vice Admirals completely useless. And these aren't supposed to be fodder Vice Admirals either. These 3 guys were important enough to have been present for a meeting with the 7 Warlords of the Sea to select who the next Warlord would be. We're not just inviting any old Marines with a bit of free time this afternoon to this meeting. No, we need sharp minds and strong fight powers in order to stand up to the Warlords if they cause trouble, and these 3 had neither of the things it is we want. And we've only actually seen one of them go on to become in any way relevant as One Piece has continued, and that would be Stainless, who was the man put in charge of capturing Buggy the Clown when the Warlord system was dissolved during Wano, and it must be said that he ended up doing a pretty rubbish job of that, as his entire fleet was destroyed by Crocodile and Dar's bones. Just the 2 of them is all it took. Meanwhile, Mozambia and Cancer haven't been seen in canon material since they made contractual appearances during the Paramount War somewhere in the background. And you've really got to wonder how Buggy saw Stainless and was in any way worried, because that that's the Vice Admiral disconnect. At this point, it's very difficult to use them dramatically. Oda tries. He's like, Vice Admiral is here. And then character reacts to Vice Admiral going, oh no. But as readers and watchers, we just can't take them seriously. And the Vice Admiral's stain has even infected once competent characters like Smoker. Pre-time skip, Smoker was an absolute beast. Someone who was completely insurmountable to Luffy. And in fact, Luffy lost against Smoker on several occasions and had to be rescued by outside effort. Not to mention that Smoker clashed relatively evenly with Ace. This guy was a huge problem. But then during the time skip, Smoker got promoted to Vice Admiral, and from that moment on, he started losing every single fight. He was beaten by Trafalgar Law, he was bested by Caesar, trounced by Virgo, who to be fair was also a Vice Admiral, so at least one Vice Admiral was putting in a decent showing. But Smoker was then also beaten by Doflamingo, something of an established Vice Admiral slayer, due to what we've explored earlier with Mozambia, Cantor, and Stainless. But during Smoker's debut as a Vice Admiral, he lost 4 times in a single arc. And look, correlation is not causation, but Smoker only started putting in a garbage performance after he was promoted to Vice Admiral, so that really makes you think. If Smoker was still a captain, I can't help but wonder what his true potential would be right now. But it's not just performance that makes the Vice Admirals feel a little less than intimidating, it's also very much their lack of performance, to which I would point vigorously in the general direction of any slobby. This was the first time in One Piece where Vice Admirals were introduced en masse as an immediate threat to the Straw Hats. Outside of filler material, that is, but we'll get to that. In chapter 420, we are left with the dramatic cliffhanger that the Buster Call has arrived at Enies Lobby, and it is being commanded by the powerhouses that are Vice Admiral Strawberry, Yamakashi, Doberman, Onigumo, and Momonga. Now, because I'm a very old man, I remember how impactful this 2-page spread was when it came out weekly. Enies Lobby was a wild time to be reading One Piece weekly. And at the end of this chapter, there was an expectation that we were going to be fighting Vice Admirals, which I don't think is unreasonable because in Robin's flashback, at least one of the Vice Admirals of the Ohara Buster Call did get very involved, and the Enies Lobby Buster Call was going to take even more effort to get under control. So it was quite disappointing when these 5 upstanding gentlemen did absolutely nothing. They just sat there on their floaty boats and watched the Straw Hats win and escape. In fact, it's slightly worse than that. In the case of Onigumo, he even helped us out quite a bit by shooting one of his own men and ordering the obliteration of the marine ship containing Luffy and Rob Lucci at the time, thus reducing the overall power of the Buster Call by 10% and making our escape significantly easier. And now I want to go through what every other Vice Admiral did during the Enies Lobby incident. So we're going to do that, and we're done. Realistically, yeah, I understand that the role of a Vice Admiral in a Buster Call is to be in command. They can't all pull a Kuzan and hit the front lines. So in terms of battle tactics, it makes a lot of sense for them to be physically inactive during Enies Lobby, but it doesn't feel quite right in a shonen battle manga where the story is actively told through physical fighting. And given that they were tactically outplayed as well, it just makes the Vice Admirals look pretty useless on both fronts. Although, given what happens when Vice Admirals do fight, there may be an argument to be made that they're actually much more intimidating when they do nothing, because it's very hard to say whether or not Oda did a better job with them during Egghead Island, which is when we summoned 9 Vice Admirals to command the Buster Call on Egghead, which included Enies Lobby veteran Vice Admiral Doberman, but also introduced us to Vice Admirals Pomsky, Dole, Tosa, Urban, Bluegrass Hound, Red King, and Guillotine. Now, the one thing I will say for these guys is that it did solve a issue with the Vice Admirals, which was that traditionally they had quite uninspiring and difficult to remember character designs. And I think that's because of how Oda needed to use them. As we've established, Vice Admirals are usually more mechanical characters. We don't want to focus on them too much because they exist as podiums to make other characters look better, which is why a lot of Vice Admirals have very, let's call them background friendly designs. Not always, of course, and especially not on Egghead Island, because the Vice Admirals here, it felt like Oda was finally taking these guys seriously, because he spent a ton of time making these Vice Admirals feel very distinct, all different shapes, sizes, ages, genders, and even races. That one guy, Urban, looks like he may even be part ancient giant. It's really cool stuff, and it is a very welcome change from just seeing an army of dudes in suits. And with Dole and Bluegrass in particular, Vice Admirals were actually a force to be reckoned with on Egghead. Those two had a pretty devastating run before Jewelry Bonnie turned them into kids, and in addition to that, they also had their own little C plot happening in the background, background when the Giants arrived, and they had their discussion about Jaguar D. Saul, who is also a former Vice Admiral, I should say. And this is a plot that's currently unresolved, but Oda does seem to be planting seeds for the future with Dole and Bluegrass, which is exciting and unexpected for Vice Admirals. But the rest of the Egghead Vice Admirals turned out to be more business as usual. One of the more notable encounters was with Red King, who briefly stood against Frankie, and he was beaten in a single punch. And look, I love Frankie. Seeing him fight is always a treat, and seeing him win is even better, but I do feel like a Vice Admiral should be able to give Frankie a bit more of a challenge than getting one shot. Meanwhile, Pomsky, right beside him, got transformed into a child and kicked by Jewelry Bonnie, whilst Guillotine just stood there and watched, very much recreating the Vice Admiral trio dynamic of Jaya, where two of them fought fruitlessly and one of them just watched. But these three were a third of the Vice Admirals brought to Egghead Island, and they were decimated by a 12-year-old girl and a cyborg in Speedos. As for the others, Tosa was defeated by Brocky, whilst Doberman, Urban, and Hound did literally nothing. Although Doberman did get one shot by Saint Saturn after the battle, so look, apparently it doesn't matter if they don't end up fighting the Straw Hats, the Vice Admirals will always find a way to get one shot regardless. Again, it's so hard to take them seriously, and that's not good because we're supposed to. But more often than not, they turn out to be jokes, and in many cases, quite literally. There's a whole series of gag Vice Admirals who exist just for the sake of a joke. Kommel is a great example of this. He was, we'll generously call him the main antagonist of Ace's cover story, and his character arc was about solving the issue with his bitter morning coffees. There's also a Vice Admiral named Nazu Ketagari, which in Japanese is a pun. His name means want to name someone, and he's the Marine in charge of assigning code names and epithets within the organization. Stuff like Ship Cutter T-Bone Black Cage Hina, and even the fact that Kobe's epithet is hero, is all canonically the doing of Nazu Ketagari. He also handles the assignment of Admiral codenames, taking a color and an animal to make Aokiji, Aokinu, Fujitora, Kizaru, Ryokugyu, etc. And this joke Vice Admiral has even named two more joke Vice Admirals, Momo Usagi and Chaton, Pink Rabbit and Brown Pig, who were actually created by readers sending in questions to Oda in the SBS segments, and Oda enjoyed them so much that they've become surprisingly prominent and even more surprisingly canon. As well as a Marine Easter egg character, every now and then in group shots you may be able to spot this Marine with a hamburger for a head. And look, I want to stress that this is not confirmed, but it is highly suspected that he is also a Vice Admiral because this entire rank is a joke. Good jokes, I should say, very good even. I love all of the Vice Admirals I just mentioned, but again, I'm not really on board with the whole idea that these are the guys who were just one step away from Kizaru. And another thing that really hasn't helped the perception of Vice Admirals is how they're portrayed in extended One Piece media, especially in the early days. Around the Skypiea era, the Vice Admiral rank was abused a fair bit because the filler writers needed to create original antagonists, and using pirates all the time would lack variety, and they couldn't touch the Admiral rank, that was forbidden, so Vice Admirals were seen as a good solution. Like Jonathan, the Vice Admiral in charge of G8, an absolutely brilliant filler arc, and Jonathan himself is an extremely well-written character. He has so much heart, but he doesn't quite pack the oomph that we've come to expect of a Vice Admiral. And in One Piece Movie 4, Dead End Adventure, the main antagonist is a former Vice Admiral named Gaspard, who definitely has a lot more of that oomph and is a big struggle to defeat, but ultimately pre-gear, pre-haki, pre-time skip Luffy does defeat him, which can also color the perception of Vice Admirals for those who do seek out the extended media. There are some very important exceptions to the Vice Admiral rank though. Obviously, we need to mention Monkey D. Garp, who is and probably always will be the most famous of Vice Admirals, but he also doesn't really count because he was offered a promotion to Admiral on multiple occasions. So I'd say a better example of an exceptional Vice Admiral would be Momonga, who we have mentioned already. He was one of the dudes who did nothing during Enies Lobby, but in his defense, he has put in a pretty decent performance post Enies Lobby, with one amazing moment of stabbing his own hand to avoid being affected by Boa Hancock's abilities, and during Marineford, Momonga also got the better of Luffy and dealt him a pretty devastating slash. Momonga is the vague model that I want all Vice Admirals to be. Whenever Momonga is on page or on screen, he is actually capable of exuding what this rank is supposed to be, but unfortunately, he's an exception. As is Virgo, a Vice Admiral double agent who may even be the exception, considering he was tough enough to essentially become the primary antagonist of Punk Hazard. And I think that Virgo displays the true challenge that Vice Admiral should present prior to innovations like Devil Fruit Awakenings and Haki Advancement. He was real difficult to beat, as all Vice Admirals should be. And look, other Vice Admirals do exist. There's Suru, her power is to do laundry. Then there's also also Hotogisu, she helps Suru do laundry. And then we have best boy Dalmatian, who to be completely fair has fingered Luffy, so he does have a accomplishment. By and large though, Vice Admirals are just extremely underwhelming. And that is one of the rare failings of One Piece in my opinion, because they have so much potential that I don't think will ever get to properly be explored. And every time I see them in the future, I know that they'll either be present to stand and react, or to kneel and become a podium for another character. Here's 21 things you probably missed during the Paramount War, starting with chapter 550, where we see a very curious unknown East Blue location, which establishes itself with an ancient building. This is quite unusual for East Blue, because despite spending ever so much time there, we don't really see anything of historical significance. At least not something that goes that far back. We see Roger's execution platform, but that's only a couple of decades ago. For the most part, it was all very modern locations, or at least modern according to the One Piece world. But what's more curious is this elderly figure discussing the upcoming war against Whitebeard, stating that if he's wise, he won't show up, and what's the life of a single ace worth versus the entire crew. So this unknown man has been the target of a lot of One Piece speculation from the fan base ever since this chapter came out, which to be clear, was a long time ago, because he has such an intricately detailed design, far and above what Oda would often use for these one-time cutaway characters. And he's portrayed as a very wise, knowledgeable figure, especially in the anime, because he goes on to say that 20 years ago, Golden Lion Shiki invaded Marineford, and that this time things are going to be much worse. He speaks like someone who has actual experience with these legendary figures, and he is fixated on as a potential lurking legend of the One Piece world. Some people have posited that this could be Copacabana because of their matching glasses, or more recently even a former member of the Rocks Pirates. And even more recently, fans have grasped onto the idea of his tattoo looking like fire and stating that this could even be the man marked by flames. I personally think that all three of these ideas are likely to be wrong, but at the same time, this isn't just some random old dude. He has definite history in this world, and I think it's absolutely criminal that he has only appeared in a single very missable panel. Something else you might miss comes from the chapter immediately preceding this one, where Buggy actually predicts the future. After accepting the admiration of the impelled down prisoners, Buggy says that he'd go on to become one of the 4 emperors and eventually the Pirate King. And while we still have yet to see him reach the Pirate King title, he has since gone on to officially become an emperor, which at the time of him saying this seemed absurd. But I would keep this page in mind, because when it comes to Buggy, you can never dismiss anything. This page right here could give away the end of the series. In chapter 542, Ace is told by Vice Admiral Onigumo to, quote, take a good look at the sky. And you know what? Thank you, Onigumo, because that turns out to be very helpful advice. Because the sky is eventually where Luffy would appear from to save Ace after an Ivankov-related accident, which after Wano makes a stupid amount of sense. Just think about it. Of course the sun god is going to appear from the sky. Luffy falling to Marineford is like a god descending to take matters into his own hands. And right before the battle begins, there is some great world building about the location of Marineford itself. We get a shot of the residential zone where all of the families of the Marines stationed there live, all of whom have been evacuated with the exception of this lone cat, who's about to have a very bad time once Whitebeard starts all of his earthquake shenaniganry. And we would continue to world build by bringing up an idea that still confuses a lot of people to this day, which is the tub current. In Japanese, it's the Tarai current, which means to be sent around, and it's this specific patch of water that exists between Marineford, Impel Down, and Enies Lobby. And once caught in this current, you can only choose to end up in one of those 3 destinations. I really like this because it shows how well thought out marine defenses and marine logistics are, because they essentially make use of this current to fast travel. For example, when the Buster Call was ordered on Enies Lobby, the use of this current meant that the ships could travel from Marineford to Enies Lobby in 30 minutes. But without the current, it could have taken hours. And also, each facility is guarded by one of the Gates of Justice, which is the source of something else that you may have missed. Before the Whitebeard pirates arrive at Marineford, the Gates of Justice suddenly open with no explanation, which allows Whitebeard's extended forces of 47 ships to sail straight into Marine HQ. Things get pretty crazy pretty quickly, so no one stops to really think about what happened here. But later on, it's explained that this was because of Lafitte, who hypnotized men in the control room to allow any ships to pass through, which also ended up helping Luffy's group. This is, like, slightly confusing though, because a lot of people believe that Lafitte did this from within Impel Down. However, it was actually performed at Marineford. Before the battle, all the remaining warlords were invited to a special dinner, and it was during this visit that Lafitte infiltrated the control room. And without this action, it may have been impossible for Whitebeard's allied forces to join the battle. Although probably not. I imagine the original plan would have been for something like Whitebeard's ship goes under, and then he uses his shockwave powers to force the gate open. Meanwhile, after Ace is revealed to be Goldie Roger's son, Gecko Moria states that, quote, everybody associated with Roger was executed, which is interesting to note because we have never seen this confirmed in any way. As far as we know, none of the Roger pirates were executed. Ray Lee still lives a long, fulfilling life, selling himself into slavery over and over again. Shanks went on to become a big shot pirate, and even Buggy was left behind to do whatever he wanted. All of Roger's rivals remained active as well. So the only basis I think we have for this statement is the child purge that the world government initiated to try and find Ace. But also that doesn't quite fit either because they weren't victims associated with Roger. They were just victims. Although I would definitely be interested to find out more about those who paid the price for actually being associated with Roger, because right now I don't see any of it. But there is a much greater Gecko Moria inconsistency within this arc. In chapter 558, Moria suddenly raises a legion of zombies, which seems consistent with his powers that we saw on Thriller Bark, but it is not actually consistent. Because Gecko Moria's power is not to summon zombies, it's to control shadows, and he needs Dr. Hogback to stitch and repair bodies to insert those shadows into to create zombies. But during Marineford, Moria is more or less just shown raising the dead. Their bodies already have stitches, and some of them even have animal parts like the centaur guy with 4 arms, and this whole bear, where did that bear come from? And they're all bandaged as well. For this to work, you have to assume that Dr. Hogback was present at the Paramount War. And not only present, but he brought a ton of animal corpses with him to stitch onto marine corpses quickly, which is strange because the easy thing to buy is that they just brought a storage of ready-made corpses with them. When I say ready-made, I guess I mean just recently killed people. And that way, all Moria needs to do is to take the shadows and insert them into the corpses. But the zombies are all Marines, which Moria implies have recently died. So this is either a very Easter egg appearance from Dr. Hogback, or this is Oda briefly forgetting the logistics of how Moria's abilities work. Now, elsewhere, whilst reminiscing on his past, I'd like to note that Ace and Thatch have a special dynamic. Looking back on it, Thatch was the first person to approach Ace after he joined the Whitebeard Pirates and extends that ever so important hand of friendship, which makes Thatcher's death hit that much harder, and drove Ace to pursue Blackbeard much more so than the murder of your average brother. During the arc, we also have a brief appearance by Vice Admiral Commodore in chapter 553, which is very appropriate because he was a big part of Ace's cover story, which ended with Ace delivering Commodore a letter from Moda. So seeing Commodore here, it's honestly a bit sad because it's a reminder of Ace's more happy and carefree days, which, according to the timeline, was like last week. When the Whitebeard division commanders step into the game, we meet a rotund gent named Blamenko, who has a devil fruit known as the Poke Poke no Mi, which allows him to pull comically large cartoon hammers out of the pockets on his face. It reminds me a lot of the current Gear 5th, and I guess that this was an early version of Oda trying to draw his wacky cartoon dreams however he could. But this is also the devil fruit that Oda said Usopp would eat if he was a user, thus allowing our sniper to have limitless storage for his arsenal at the low cost of face pockets. I actually think that Blamenko stitched those pockets to his own face, which triggered the effect of the fruit due to pockets coming into existence. And look, I get making more pockets, but putting them on your face it's a bold choice, sir. In chapter 555, we see a flashback of Ace having made Oz Jr. a lovely hat, along with a very, very early mention of Wano. And we would later discover that Ace learned how to make the Amigasa hats from Tama, thus making her indirectly responsible for this bonding moment with Oz Jr. Also, during a short Luffy Ace flashback, you can see the tip of a third sake cup, which hints at Sambo, a character whose existence wouldn't be confirmed until after the war had concluded. But One Piece fans are pretty ravenous when it comes to their attention to detail, and after spotting that tip, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that there was a secret third brother. But for more brothers, during this arc, we also met the Calvin brothers, who are sort of like a better version of the Meow Band brothers, Sham and Butchie. They elect to wear gloves with cat-like claws, and in the anime, they even use the cat theming rather well to briefly have the brothers fight against Dalmatian, a very obviously dog-based marine. Which is fun, because one of the only failings about Marineford, in my opinion, was not really getting to know Whitebeard's forces that well. A lot of them come off as background characters, and Oda did do his best to rectify that later. Such as here during a collage of the Whitebeard allied captains, where we see a guy with a squid on his head. This guy, his name is Karma, and he's the one who was threatening Toki in the Odin flashback. He was captain of his own crew, and he went on to become a son of Whitebeard. He's also an octopus fisherman and uses six-sword style just like Hachan. However, he has 6 human arms, and in my opinion, he is definitely definitely more man than he is fish. And although it's almost never seen, Haki is mentioned a surprising amount during this conflict. Before we discover what it actually is with Rayleigh's explanation, people are just tossing the word around everywhere. There's even a funny part where Vista and Marco attack Akainu and he says, you Haki users can be such a handful, which implies that they're quite unusual to fight when in reality, no one is fighting on this level without basic and likely advanced armament Haki, so weird thing to say, Mr. Akainu. Speaking of advanced Haki, on the side of the Navy, there's also a section where the 3 Marine Admirals use advanced armament Haki to block Whitebeard's attack from hitting the execution platform. And how they actually managed to accomplish this isn't something that we would have explained to us until Wano. They were projecting their Haki, and in fact, this might be the single strongest projection of armament Haki that we've still seen to date, because it was a combination of Haki from all 3 Admirals, which is gonna mess anyone up pretty badly. Together, they are very powerful, but separately, they all got wrecked by Whitebeard. During this arc, Whitebeard fights all 3 Admirals individually, but he's not the only one. There is one other character who goes up against all 3 Admirals individually, and that would be Buggy, sort of. He gets frozen by Kuzan, shot at by Kizaru, and chased with a magma fist by Akainu. He also survived an attack from the world's greatest swordsman, formed an alliance with Whitebeard, and had a lovely chat with Shanks. This right here is the reason why Buggy is such a big deal. I should say that one other person does face all 3 Admirals, but not individually. No, he elected to do it all at once because notable Mad Lad Monkey D. Luffy holds the honor of being, I think, the only person in One Piece to ever take on a complete set of Admirals at the same time. I mean, it didn't go particularly well, but it's cool that he has that title. Furthermore, a lot of people miss this, but during the war, we get a top 3 versus top 3. There's a part during the battle when the top 3 Whitebeard pirates are simultaneously facing off against the 3 Admirals. Whitebeard versus Akainu, Marco versus Kizaru, and Jozu versus Aokiji. And in a very symbolic moment, Whitebeard's sickness causes him to grab his chest, which then gives all 3 Admirals the opportunity to injure and or defeat their opponents. And this one moment is the turning point of the entire conflict. At this stage, the Whitebeard pirates simply could not recover the momentum that they had during the early invasion. Very tragic stuff. Almost as tragic as this one panel of Jewelry Bonnie, who we see reacting to the war being broadcast on Sabadi. And at the time, we had no idea what she was so sad about. The leading idea was that she also had a relationship to Whitebeard, but the truth ended up being far more depressing than any of us could have imagined, because here she was seeing her father Kuma for the first time since he left her on the Sorbet Kingdom, after having lost all of his memories. Now, as for Sakazuki, he never loses his memories and he knows how to hold quiet the grudge. You may or may not have noticed that Sakazuki never refers to Luffy as Luffy. He always calls him Son of Dragon, hinting that he and Dragon have some history that we have yet to uncover. Genuinely, he only does that with Luffy. He doesn't call Ace Son of Roger or something like that. So there's definitely something uniquely enraging about Dragon, which is bad news for Luffy, and likely why Sakazuki made it his top priority to attempt to kill him. Now, on the steak menu, we also have some secret beef on offer between Vista and Yasop of all people. After Shanks stops the war, we have a single panel featuring Marco being flanked by Vista and Yasop glaring at each other in disgust. It's almost like how Zoro and Sanji look at each other. And it was confirmed in the Deep Blue data book that something happened in the past between them that these two have yet to forgive each other for. Next, when Luffy uses a burst of Conqueror's Haki, look, we didn't know this at the time, but it knocks out Galdino, who is posing as one of the executioners, but also Django, who we see in a cameo appearance on the floor. And also in this moment, Vice Admiral Doberman, another dog-based marine, isn't surprised because he's the son of Dragon, strongly implying that Dragon has Conqueror's Haki as well. Although this is a fact that we still have yet to confirm at the time of this recording. And it's also highly speculated that the reason why Doberman knows this is because Dragon was likely a marine. There's also a short scene of Dracula Mihawk casually slicing up Dar's bones, which was a purposeful narrative maneuver to prove that Mihawk can cut through steel, but not only that, but he can cut through it significantly easier than Zoro could. Thus setting up the idea that, yeah, Zoro's come a long way, but he still has an impossible mountain to climb. But Marineford as an arc has so many iconic panels, but two of my favorites have to be Luffy and Ace after Ace is freed, because he often gets neglected, but Mr. 3 is present in the background of both of these panels, one being carried by Luffy and another on the floor once they all land. And after everything Mr. 3 did for them, they just leave him there. He went to the execution platform, he made the key. He also saved them both from Sengoku. He is the reason why they can escape, and Luffy and Ace just abandon him on the floor. And then Mr. 3 is surrounded by Marines moments later, so I guess that's what you get for doing the right thing, not making that mistake again. Now, after the war's conclusion, we cut to some reactions from the worst generation. One is of Diaz Drake and his crew using a black Denden Mushi, which is used to eavesdrop, wiretap, and communicate securely. Out of context, this scene would imply that Drake had tapped into Marine communications. However, it's far more likely that he's receiving a report from another member of SWORD, an organization that we aren't even close to knowing exists at this point in the story. There's also some very troubling aftermath in chapter 581 when it's revealed that the escape of the level 6 prisoners is going to be kept a secret so that the public wouldn't lose confidence in the world government. To be clear, we are not talking about the Blackbeard pirates. That is public knowledge. There's not much we can do about that. What we're talking about here are all of the other level 6 prisoners that escaped, because there were a lot of them. And remember, these are some of the most powerful and most deranged pirates to have ever sailed the seas, and the world government has decided to just let them loose in the world without so much as a warning to the public. But as a warning to the world government, part of Whitebeard's final speech hints at an event that still has yet to come to pass. Sengoku, you and the world government fear the great war that will come to this world one day. I'm not interested in the treasure, but when it's found, the whole world will be turned upside down, which is referencing the war that Kozuki Oden predicted in his flashback that he describes as a massive war, terrible enough to split the seas themselves. And while Oden learned the truth himself and Whitebeard was probably told by Roger, you do need to wonder exactly how is it that Sengoku knows about it. So there's a lot more people that know the truth about this world than I think we realize. But for now, that's 21 things that you may or may not have missed during the Paramount War. The Admirals of One Piece are officially living on borrowed time. By the end of the series, it's going to be lights out for Kizaru, it's going to be weeding season for Ryokugyu, and eruptions will cease due to magma sources becoming depleted and causing unstable volcanic structures to become susceptible to landslides and debris avalanches for Sakazuki. Couldn't come up with a clever one for him, but you get the idea. In the final war, this generation is going to be wiped out, and the next generation of admirals will rise up to guide the Marines in a post-Dawn of the World. So we need 3 new candidates to take on the mantle of the greatest military might within the Marines, and at the moment the only guaranteed candidate to become an admiral in my mind is Kobe, who exclaimed his dream to become a Marine admiral in chapter 433. And he didn't just yell it, he yelled it with a certain sense of resolve that only Eiichiro Oda can visually depict. In the same way that I believe Luffy when he says he'll become the Pirate King, I believe Kobe. But that's not all he said, because Mr. Kobe actually has a plan, a path by which he plans on becoming an admiral. There's a new era coming, and the people who can guide that new age are gathering on the ocean. The one who can master those oceans will become king of the pirates. Luffy, let's meet again there. I will be the one to catch you. I'll train to become even stronger so I can do that. One day, I will become an admiral in the Navy. So Kobe there being even bolder than this image of Sanji without hair that I found on the internet, and because I got cursed with it, so must all of you. And I do know that up until recently, a lot of One Piece fans maybe haven't had the most amount of faith in Kobe to make good on these words, because he's gotten much stronger over time, but the rate of growth fell so far behind Luffy. However, even as readers and watchers may have lost faith in him, Luffy never did. Luffy believes in Kobe in the same way that he believes in the rest of the Straw Hats. So if Kobe says that he's going to capture him and become a Marine Admiral, or the other way around, become an Admiral and then catch Luffy, doesn't matter, because Luffy doesn't doubt it, and neither do we anymore. Kobe's honesty impact on Hachinosu has converted most of the naysayers into yay-sayers, or at least yay-thinkers, but it's not the demonstration of power that really got me here. It was the flashback of Kobe's process to attain it. I have less natural talent at fighting than other people, so 10 times the effort isn't enough. It needs to be 100 or 200. I need more practice. If I don't put the work in, I can't be a great sailor who keeps people safe. And so Kobe trained in secret using Garp's battleship bags, with even Garp shocked at how far Kobe was willing to go. And to me, it is impossible to doubt the willpower of a man who went to this extreme. Kobe will become an admiral, although it is quite a bittersweet thought though, because it means that there is a very real possibility that Kobe will capture Luffy, and that'll be how Luffy's story ends. And I don't know if this will happen by the end of One Piece, but I'm a pretty firm believer that at some point in the future of this world, Kobe will become the Fleet Admiral. But before we move too far from Kobe, I also want to address Mr. Helmeppo, who I've long since championed as a man of throbbing potential, so much so that he could sit beside Kobe as a fellow admiral. It could happen, but realistically, I do feel like Helmeppo's probably going to remain Kobe's second in command. Every now and then, Eiichiro Oda likes to make the future very clear for us by drawing direct comparisons to the past, like how young Roger looked, spoke, and acted exactly like Luffy, or Zoro following in each and every footstep trod by Silver's Rayleigh right down to the scar. And Sanji's interests very much align with the missionary of love that is Copacabana. And you can see the same thing happening with Kobe and Helmeppo. Kobe is very obviously becoming the next generation's Garp, inheriting his fighting style, and he's already known all throughout the world as a hero. Meanwhile, Helmeppo is taking the path of Garp's second-in-command Bogard, the trusted comrade standing slightly behind Garp, and Bogard is the one responsible for training Helmeppo in the art of sharp metal. So as much as I'd love to see it, I'm not sure if Helmeppo's going all the way to Admiral. Vice Admiral though, that could happen. But for someone who could make it all the way to the top 3, I don't think we should discount current Rear Admiral Prince Gru, because he has something of a petty rivalry with Kobe. Gru has actually publicly stated that he plans on sabotaging Kobe because he cannot believe that Kobe is considered to be the future of the Marines, and Gru is always trying to suck up to Garp and get some much needed morsels of praise to fill his hollow clay soul. It's nothing to be taken seriously though. It's a gag trait, like Hannibal wanting to become the Warden of Impel Down. Although I guess that did actually go on to happen, but at heart Prince Gru is aligned with Kobe's ideology, and as one of the highest ranking and bestest fighting members of Sword, with an insanely overpowered devil fruit, I think that he can do it. Because the most confusing thing about Prince Gru is that his name is Prince and he's also a literal prince. So if you were to render his full name in English, title and everything, it would be Prince Gru Prince. And this is because in Japanese, Oda uses Oji as his title and the English word prince as his surname. I do think he'd fit in very well as an admiral though, because Gru has this very clear and unique sense of style, which every other Marine admiral has had. Prince Gru here with his funky long cap. And the story behind this really long hat is that Gru always used to look down at the floor as a child, and he kept bumping into walls and cows and other stuff including pirates that beat him up. So his mother's solution to this was to make Gru wear a hat so long that he wouldn't be able to look down, and so he was forced to look ahead. So we are always looking forward into the future and not into the butts of pirates. And that's my biggest endorsement of Prince Gru. He is the next generation. There's a lot of Marines, many of which we'll go through in this video, who are better positioned right now to become an admiral, but they are the current generation, whilst Prince Gru is part of a very special generation fostered by Garp for the purpose of protecting justice in the future. So I think there's a pretty great chance that Gru does live up to that legacy eventually. And we may even see Hibari do the same and go all the way to becoming an admiral, perhaps forming a next generation monster admiral trio with Kobe and Gru. Although that's not the main reason why I see a lot of potential within Hibari. She could become an admiral because of her connection to current Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. And I will stress it's not confirmed at the time of this recording, but Hibari is almost certainly Sakazuki's daughter. If you're interested in learning more about that, there's a whole video's worth of insane evidence available here, but given that likely connection, Hibari becoming an admiral would be almost to make amends for her father's mistakes, and perhaps to even fulfill his will just in a much more pleasant way. Sakazuki is a man who doesn't want to do evil. He wants to protect the good, but he uses evil as a tool to protect that good. However, Hibari fights using a completely pacifist philosophy. She uses Vegapunk's non-lethal GP flower bullets, so not only does Hibari not kill anyone, but she doesn't even hurt anyone. She just disarms and pacifies them. And so Hibari could become an admiral to pursue her own sense of absolute justice, where absolute means that absolutely no one will be sacrificed in the pursuit of justice. My personal theory is that Sakazuki is going down the path he is in order to build a better world for Hibari, one where she can be safe. And it could be quite touching for Hibari to at least fulfill that final desire in his stead, as I find it very unlikely that a man drowning in as much blood as Sakazuki is gonna live through to see the end of One Piece. But we also have yet to talk about one of the most obvious candidates, being Mr. Smoker, who actually meets almost every classic admiral criteria, having a Logia-type devil fruit and being so strongly associated with a certain color, and as a current vice admiral, he's only a single promotion away from the admiral rank. And in the post-time skip era, he's even taken a direct stand against the thorough justice of Sakazuki, which is the idea that you need to destroy evil at its very roots to make sure that no trace of taint remains. Meanwhile, Smoker, in Toshiki's body, believes the following: as long as man joins together to conspire against man, there is no such thing as a perfect, untainted organization. Assumptions will let the real enemy walk free. Don't be deceived by appearances. So this is a very pessimistically optimistic approach. Smoker believes that evil can never truly be eradicated, but he does believe that it can be managed and the good can be protected. And more importantly, the good can be found in unexpected places, as can evil. And he obviously states not to make assumptions and be deceived by appearances because he's been in multiple situations where Marines have turned out to be enemies enemies, and pirates have turned out to uphold justice. And look, this might be going a bit too far, but if anything, I think that Smoker may even be Fleet Admiral material. Again, I think that Kobe will eventually get there, but he's probably not the immediate next choice, whereas Smoker is much closer in rank, much richer in experience, and does seem to be set up by Oda to be an ideological counter to Sakazuki. Although it is extremely difficult to picture Smoker in a role involving such a high level of administration, the stress might even cause him to start smoking a whole mouthful of cigars at a time. But another strong candidate for Admiralty has to be Diaz Drake, simply because he is the captain of Sword, the internal force of blatantly protagonistic Marines that will almost certainly inherit what's left of the organization after absolute justice has been defeated and purged during the final war. And just like Smoker, looking at Admiral may be too low. With his current position of leadership, should Sword prevail, he may even be the next natural choice for Fleet Admiral, because there are hints that Drake may become the overall resistance leader within the Marines once Sakazuki inevitably cracks it and goes full absolute dictator, one of which is that Drake's birthday is October 24th, which marks the beginning of the October Revolution in Russia according to the Julian calendar, not the other one which was in November, but we don't pay attention to that. And usually I'd be happy to say that this sort of thing is just a coincidence, because you can pick any day of the year and something of relevance must have happened on that day at some point in human history. For example, I was born on August 17th, which just so happens to be the day that Indonesia's independence from the Dutch was declared. So you know what? You're welcome, Indonesia. However, Drake is a very curious case, because in the Deep Blue Data Book, his birthday was originally given as October 10th. However, in the SBS of Volume 64, Oda changed it to October 24th. So I think this is a case where you can read intentional meaning into a birthday, because Drake's one of only two characters who have ever had their birthdays changed. The other would be Viola, but this puts Drake in a very intriguing position, primed for rebellious leadership against the existing institution, and you'd need to imagine that whoever the key face of rebellion is would be the natural candidate for leadership in the aftermath. Although that also does depend on a certain someone. We still don't know what his connection to Sword is, or if he does have a connection to Sword, but current Admiral Fujitora is, in terms of rank, power, wisdom, and gambling losses, far greater than any other protagonistic Marine, and it would be extremely easy to slot him into the Fleet Admiral position as well, perhaps with a complement of very supportive admirals under him, comprising of Smoker, Drake, and Kobe. Although I can't help but feel that Kobe is the odd one out there. Smoker and Drake, they're both in their mid-30s, and Kobe, he's only 18. So there is that generational barrier there that One Piece doesn't often ignore. And there are many other candidates who do make more logical sense than Kobe at this point, two of which are Momo Usagi and Chaton. These characters were created by readers of One Piece in an SBS segment in the early post-time skip days, where readers were trying to guess who the new admirals were going to be. And Oda loved these characters so much that he made them real and put them into the actual series. And canonically, because they've already been given epithets, Momo Usagi, Pink Rabbit, Chaton, Brown Pig, canonically, they are directly in line to become admirals. These two are admirals in waiting. And they'd both be pretty decent choices for us because they're quite firmly embedded within the Garp Justice faction. So I imagine that both of them are quite trustworthy and decent human people. But I'm gonna use the same argument that I used for Buggy becoming the Pirate King. I can see that happening because Buggy reaching the top spot would be the funniest possible option. And with Momo Usagi and Chaton, it would be amazing to have two fan-made characters end the series as admirals and have it be like Eiichiro Oda is allowing the readers to inherit his legacy and will. But Egghead Island has also brought forth some late-stage potential admirals as well. It's very hard to ignore Vice Admiral Dole for many reasons, but she's a very unique Vice Admiral in that she's not a joke character, she's fairly no-nonsense, and her heart does seem to be in the right place despite her words and actions saying otherwise. Even considering Kobe, of all of the existing Marines, Dole is the one who reminds me most of Garp, especially with her fighting style, which is just very raw and very satisfying fist punching. There honestly aren't that many Vice Admirals with the strength to even consider them capable of becoming an Admiral. The gap between those ranks is just too wide, gaping even, and I'm not convinced that Dole is anywhere near there yet, but she definitely has, that Garp flair. And so I could see that taking her a very long way in the future. And someone else who also has that Garp flair would be wildcard Admiral candidate Jaguar D. Sol, a former Marine Vice Admiral whose hobbies include surviving genocide and pretending to be dead on beaches. Someone who could never ever return to the Marines in its current incarnation, but we don't know what the Marines are going to look like in the future, just that it's probably not going to be this. There must have been a reason why Sol joins the Marines in the first place. He's not like other giants within the organization, many of whom were sold to the Marines as children directly from Elbaf. Saul isn't from Elbaf, so he joined out of his own desire to something justice. However, he became disillusioned with the Marines after meeting Robin's mother. But if that part of the Marines was washed away, the filthy part, then would Saul be interested in pursuing justice once more? Because there's still a lot of people within the Marines who remember Saul, like the aforementioned Vice Admiral Dole, who stated that Saul was her superior officer 2 decades ago, and Bluegrass even commented that Saul was very strong even for a giant. So Saul is quite clearly revered within the Marines, an almost legendary figure, and under the right conditions, it's very possible that Saul could not only assume his post, but even be granted an admiral position for the new era. Remembering that Saul is only 127 years old and still has more than a century left in his prime. Of course, all of this assumes that the Marines will still exist by the end of One Piece, and it is a very prominent idea that by the end of the series, the Marines will not exist anymore at all, that everything to do with the world government will be brought to ruin, and we will have to rebuild from absolute zero with the dawn of the world. But I'm personally not sure if this is going to be the case, primarily because the Marines are an organization that the majority of world government nations, aka the majority of the planet, still have faith in. After Whitebeard died during the Paramount War, the reaction around the world was mainly one of celebration because, yeah, the good guys won. And I think that it would be a big task to completely destroy the Marines just given how many people around the world have faith in them. I just can't see a situation where the Marines are obliterated and say Dragon and the Revolutionary Army step in to take charge in what appears to be a very hostile takeover. That's not going to be the way to make the world feel safe, and it doesn't need to be either, because a huge amount of Marines have the world's best interest at heart. So I think the best way forward would be to remove the world nobles, but to have the Marines inherited by the faction that shares Kobe's ideology to actually start serving and upholding the values that the world government nations believe the Marines exist for. We have some massive revelations regarding the legendary Garp the hero, some equally as shocking information about his protege Helmeppo, Miss Buckingham Stussie's devil fruit reveal, the secret history behind Sakazuki and Borsellino, a foreboding fact about Blackbeard, and a former lover of Who's Who who's breaking her silence. This information all comes to us courtesy of the Egghead Island Vivia card set, which has been translated by the Library of Ohara and Pew Peace on Twitter, so thanks for that, but we need to get into some big fictional news here. According to the Vivia card data book, Monkey D. Garp is officially a user of Conqueror's Haki, which may seem obvious given who he is and what he does, but here's the thing, Garp has been covered so many times in these data books, and now even multiple Vivia cards specifically, but they've always avoided outright stating whether or not he was a user of Conqueror's Haki. And this is causing a little bit of controversy online because Kuzan was also included in this batch of Vivia cards and he has no Conqueror's Haki listed, meaning that he went head to head with a Garp at a pretty massive Haki disadvantage, and he still came out, I was going to say on top, but I guess it was more of a team effort. Still, it's incredibly impressive that Kuzan was able to fight on this level against the will of a Conqueror, because fun fact, there isn't a single Marine Admiral who has ever been confirmed as a Conqueror's Haki user, except for Sengoku, who was an Admiral at one point, and I'm not going to count him. But after Sengoku, Garp is only the second Marine to have confirmed Conqueror's Haki. The reason for this is probably because, as Admirals, they've made a choice to submit to the world government, and therefore they lack the will of a true conqueror, unlike Garp, who refused to submit and carved out his own space within the organization, which is very much reflected in his justice motto, which has finally been revealed in these cards, and it is simply my justice, which I love because Garp won't even submit to an ideology. He refuses to be ruled by the concepts of absolute, unclear, or even lazy justice, because at all times Garp is a man who pursues his own ideals, except for that one time with Ace. That was a bit of a whoopsie. The my in my justice was very much missing during the Paramount War, or was it? This is where not having a pillar to lean on like unclear or absolute justice really starts to screw you over, because as the events of Marineford played out, it is now clear that everything Garp did or refused to interfere with was what he genuinely thought was best for the world. Back to Haki, though, I wouldn't rule out some admirals developing it in the future, particularly the ones that have either ascended or broken out of the system. Just like Kuzan, and the other thing of note revealed for him is that he will have a bounty assigned to him, as he is now a filthy filthy pirate. However, it's currently being debated and calculated at Marine HQ, and my guess is that it would likely be just over 3 billion berries, which is roughly the value of the OG admirals. And part of this calculation is likely due to the recent events of defeating Garp on Hachinosu. And so Kuzan could end up having a bounty that's much closer to Blackbeard himself and really approaching that 4 billion mark. 4 billion is quite the overwhelming number, and the world of One Piece in general can be quite overwhelming as well. But for our next trick, suspected vampire and queen of Suck, Miss Buckingham Stussy has been officially outed as a devil fruit user, and it's a surprisingly simple Zoan called the Bat fruit. So it's not the vampire fruit, although that's pretty much the effect it has when combined with a human, just because the fusion between human and bat is the very stereotypical pop culture depiction of a vampire. And this is the sort of fruit that I'd put into the same basket woven out of the straw of Basil Hawkins' fruit, which is a simple straw fruit, but it gives him access to the art of voodoo, specifically the Waraningyo straw dolls. With that said, Stussy wasn't even originally meant to be a bat, and in fact, Oda tried to give her a whole ton of different Zoans. The Stussy sketches are pretty hilarious because you've got a couple of very bird-looking ones, but at one stage she was also going to be a panda Zoan, which I think would have been awesome. I love me some pandas. And at one stage, Stussy was also going to have a cat fruit, which reminds me of the rejected idea of Marguerite's cat Zoan fruit. I think it's clear that Oda obviously wants some sort of hot cat woman in the story at some stage, and I have no doubt that he'll make it happen eventually, but for today, we have Bat. We also have confirmation that Stussy was born on the Mad Slab vessel 36 years ago, meaning that she was successfully cloned 3 years after the God Valley incident. And I have seen it argued on the internet that this is a bit of a retcon, because when Stussy was introduced to us on Whole Cake Island, Dufeld made a joke about Stussy's age when she said that pudding reminded her of a younger version of herself. Dufeld did this rather snide. How many decades ago was that? Which, considering that Stussy is only 36, not that many decades ago, it's startlingly close to my age. So I don't think this is a retcon or an inconsistency though. I think it's more likely that it's because Stussy uses the name Buckingham Stussy, and so she gets mistaken for the real one, who is now 76 years old. Although it is possible that Oda hadn't decided to make Stussy a clone at that stage, but then again, he'd already had that idea in mind for Edward Weevil at the end of Dressrosa. I'm not so sure. Either way, it works out well enough in this world, because it's not like Stussy being a clone is public information. But as for her egghead ally Sentomaru, we've confirmed that he comes from a place called Mount Kintoki in the Grand Line, which I should say is an actual mountain that exists in Japan that people climb because it gives them amazing views of Mount Fuji. But there's a lot more to it than that, because Sentomaru is practically plagiarized from Kintaro, a hero in Japanese folklore. His name means golden boy, and he was renowned for being able to beat assorted monsters, demons, and most importantly, sumo wrestling bears into submission. And that's why as a child, Sentomaru subdued all of the bears around him. It was a reference to that. And at the Kintoki Shrine is where it's said that Kintaro's axe lies to this very day. But our big boy has some even bigger news, because Sentomaru officially has a cross-guild bounty of 500 million berries, which was Luffy's bounty after defeating Doflamingo on Dressrosa. So Sentomaru is kind of like that pig full of money that dangles over everyone in Squid Game. Same shape at the very least. But this is one of those cross-guild special bounties, because generally 500 million is reserved for the rank of Vice Admiral. But then again, I don't think we ever actually learned what rank Sentomaru was. He did become a Marine officer during the time skip, but we have yet to know where he falls in the hierarchy that he no longer belongs to, as he sails away on his own in a teeny tiny boat. And someone who can't fit in a wide array of boats is Blackbeard. And something rather shocking about his Vivia card set is that it reveals his flower motif. So at this point, most characters have a flower motif. This was started by Nico Robin's voice actor, who assigned a flower to each straw hat, and then someone thought, that's a good idea, let's do it for everyone. And usually they're not worth mentioning, but Blackbeard, as usual, is a special case. His assigned flower is the red spider lily, which is a symbol of death in Japan. Although elsewhere its meaning is more one of sad memories, often last goodbyes or the death of a loved one. And sad memories seems to fit Blackbeard's past really well. I'm thinking specifically of that image of him looking up at the moon crying and such. Also, Blackbeard's birthplace has finally been listed. It was in the Grand Line in a location known as Shade Port, which probably gives Blackbeard the right to use the Bane quote about being born in the darkness, etc. But switching to the light, this set also covers Bartholomew Kuma, who has 3 epithets, being the Tyrant, the Pacifist, pacifist and the superhero, which really goes to show how fragmented the global impression of Kuma is, and my feeling is that he's known as a superhero to Bonnie, which is heartbreaking but nowhere near as heartbreaking as this next thing, being that Kuma's hobbies are traveling, writing letters, and fantasizing, which is another gut punch because his hobbies are essentially dreaming of the life that he wanted to live with Ginny and Bonnie. Also, fantasizing is a surprisingly important word here because there's a few different ways of saying fantasy and fantasizing in Japanese, and it has been noted that the way it's written on Kuma's Vivia card is the same way that Oda answered the question about Luffy's Gear 5th powers, which he said were a gateway to Nika's fantasy. Interesting. Also interesting is that Kuma's least favorite food is lobster, which happens to be one of the favorite foods of all the world nobles, so there's probably some sort of trauma happening there. And we also have some more information about Ginny, who had an insane bounty of 190 million berries when she was a Revolutionary Army commander. That is wildly high, almost double Luffy's bounty after defeating Crocodile. So the world government takes the Revolutionary Army very seriously, which is why I still think that Dragon might have the highest bounty in One Piece. Ginny was of course the East Army commander, so at one time she would have been the most valuable person based in East Blue. Alas, Kuma and Ginny's relationship had a rather tragic ending, but nowhere near as tragic as the story of Catherine and her assorted lovers. This is a weird piece of unexpected lore, but I love it. So I often talk at great length about Catherine, the waitress on Any Slobby who dumped Jabra because she wanted to date Rob Lucci instead. She wanted a bit of an upgrade. However, as it turns out, Catherine has an even more expanded history and also once dated Who's Who when he was a Cypherpol agent. But she also dumped him to take a chance at dating Rob Lucci, which apparently didn't work out as she got the Jabra consolation prize. But for a relationship that did actually work out, we also check in with Mr. Nine and Miss Monday, who stayed on Whiskey Peak, engaged in some intercourse, and produced a baby whose name has finally been revealed, and he is called Nande, which means what a day is it. But now the information that everyone has been waiting for, the names and roles of the germ pirates. These were the wacky weirdos who rocked up during Capone Gang Beija's cover story on Dressrosa, and going from left to right we have Tsukare Karehosui, the younger sister of the crew's captain, who despite being selfish and bullying him, legitimately cares about him. Then we see Dr. Rakushitamo Terusuba Hainaika, the mad scientist of the germ pirates who developed the Kiss Kiss germ and who only joined the crew to further his research as he has no interest in piracy. So this will probably never happen, but he could be a good potential Neomads candidate. I could see Caesar and Judge getting along real well with this guy. Then in the center we have Tsukare Tainen, who is the captain and no further details given. And next to him we have Meza Suwanpi Suo, who is my favorite germ pirate member because his name literally means let's find the One Piece. And finally we have Shikonktai, a member of the crew who loves scaring people with the skull on his head, and due to a policy of not physically harming people, he fights purely by spreading germs. So he's a semi-pacifist. He won't hit you, but he will hit your immune system with some not good stuff. For some slightly more well-known characters, there was an interesting lore drop about Sakazuki and Borsellino, which is that they both joined the Marines at the same time approximately 32 years ago, and swiftly after became known as the Monster Rookies. So back in their day, they were part of their own worst generation. Although it probably wasn't known as that in the Marines. For them, it was like, they're the best generation. The Seraphim are also very present in this Vivia card set, and there's nothing huge here except for the Seraphim themselves, because my god, they're tall. For example, S-Snake, by far the smallest of all of them, is 208 centimeters, which is actually taller than a fully grown adult boa Hancock. I knew they were big, I just didn't think they were that big. But what's very interesting is the confirmation that each of the Seraphim are able to use armament and observation haki, which is very relevant considering that haki is weaponized willpower, which is another hint that the Seraphim should eventually break out of the command system, because the Seraphim project just so happened to have cloned 7 of the strongest willed people in the world, and the Vivia card pack only includes the Aircat Island Seraphim, so we don't see Crocodile, Gecko Moria, or Doflamingo's ones, although I would assume that they all have haki as well, which would be pretty funny considering that Moria and Crocodile pre-time skip did not. And also, each of them are listed as their own unique race. So S-Bear is known as Bartholomew Kuma Seraphim, S-Snake is known as Boa Hancock Seraphim, etc., which I guess emphasizes that each of them really are their own unique existence. Meanwhile, Kobe's unique existence, if he wasn't a pirate, is that he'd become a preschool teacher, which is actually the same profession that Nami would take up, so I'd like to imagine that Kobe and Nami would be teaching at the same school. Kobe be damned though, because we have news regarding the much more superior Helmeppo. The only character who was shown completely nude in One Piece live action has a cross-guild bounty of a whopping 100 million berries, and I really want us all to just sit here or stand and take this in, because Helmeppo is now worth as much as post-Alabasta Luffy. However, this does contradict information revealed in Oda's 10-question Q&A, which stated that Helmeppo's rank of lieutenant commander would only be valued at 1 million berries. But actually, as it turns out, most sword members are considerably more valuable than their respective ranks. Hibari, for example, is the same rank as Helmeppo, and she's worth twice as much at 200 million berries. Meanwhile, Prince Gru and Kujaku are 500 million each. As rear admirals, their value should be 200. So how wild is it that these two characters together are worth 1 billion berries? I mean, would you rather have Prince Gru and Kujaku or one Katakuri? Actually, I don't even know why I asked that. I know that most of you are going to choose Gru and Kujaku, but mostly for Kujaku-based reasons. I know what you're all like. My guess for why these bounties are so high is that either sword is a known entity and that all of its members qualify for special bounties, or that these numbers have been raised as a result of the invasion of Hachinosu, with each of them proving just how much of a pain they can be to pirates. Prince Gru definitely feels pretty accurate because his devil fruit is insane, although Prince Gru was originally supposed to have a different devil fruit called the Shuko Shuko no Mi, or the Cut fruit, which does sound similar to Inazuma's devil fruit, which is the Choki Choki no Mi, or Snip Snip fruit. However, when I researched the Shuko Shuko onomatopoeia, what comes up is that it's more like the sound of squeezing a pump. Shuko, shuko, shuko. So I'm not quite sure where the cutting part's coming from. I'm not good enough at Japanese for that, nor can I imagine how it would have been different from Inazuma's fruit. And just one extra note on Hibari, there is another piece of information linking her to Sakazuki. Hibari's Vivia card says that she's from North Blue, which is also where he's from, and that could play into her 200 million berry bounty. If she was publicly known to be Sakazuki's daughter, then that would likely qualify as a very special marine. And if you want to know more about this connection, which is bizarre extensive, and I have a whole video waiting for you to watch right now. Kuzan versus Sakazuki was one of the most pivotal moments in all of One Piece. This 10-day battle on Punk Hazard decided so much more of our future than you know. So here's our question. What would have happened if Kuzan won? How radically does the story shift with him as Fleet Admiral? Well, I can already tell you, if Kuzan became the Fleet Admiral, then a very prominent character would have joined the Revolutionary Army, a beloved character would have tragically died, and weirdest of all, we would actually have a new Straw Hat Pirate. And that is just a small taste. I can't even begin to explain just how absurdly this world changes with one difference. But I'm going to have to because that's what the video is about. Stepping back in time 2 years before the time that it is now, we find ourselves in the struggle that would decide the fate of the world. Former Fleet Admiral Sengoku had stepped down following the Paramount War and recommended then Admiral Aokiji to take his place. However, the 5 Elder Stars, despite being notoriously chill guys, wanted a much more aggressive and hotter approach to global policing and thus crowned then Marine Admiral Akainu as the brand new head Marine guy. Kuzan was not pleased with this. He was not pleased at all. Remembering that Kuzan was present on Ohara when Sakazuki committed that slight genocide, it's fairly natural that Kuzan did not trust him with full command over the largest military in the world. So a sort of throne war began, because both admirals did have something of a claim to the position. Sakazuki, of course, had the stronger claim, but we needed to settle things somehow, and that somehow was punch fighting. Punk Hazard was chosen as the battleground, and for 10 days, these two elemental and ideological opposites fought in vicious fight battling to the death, where ultimately Sakazuki emerged victorious. Except not, because in our version of events, this razor-thin struggle was won by Kuzan. And immediately we need to make a big decision, which is, does Kuzan kill Sakazuki? The thing to remember about this is it wasn't just a fight to see who was going to become the next Fleet Admiral. This was supposed to be a fight to the death. And oddly enough, in the canon version of events, it was Sakazuki who showed mercy to Kuzan. But would Kuzan do the same? I personally think he would, because even though every fiber of his being knows that Sakazuki is going to be a big problem in the future, it is so hard to see him outright murdering Sakazuki here. And I put this question to all of you, actually, and after 72,000 votes, 83% of the Grand Fleet agreed that Kuzan would have spared Sakazuki's life. I also think that killing him would have caused morale problems. I mean, one admiral killing another, that seems very barbaric and almost like a pirate-esque way of solving things, which in the end, I think is a big part of why Sakazuki actually spared Kuzan's life. Whoever the victim may be, showing their opponent mercy solidifies them as a leader that the world can get behind. And as one commenter quite eloquently put it, this is One Piece. No good guy or good guy adjacent does the kill murdering, at least not intentionally, and I agree. But after sparing Sakazuki's life, Kuzan is officially sworn in as the Fleet Admiral. There might even be a parade where all the Marines go yay and such, but then we're down to business. And the first big change under Kuzan is going to be the general approach to justice, which is significantly less aggressive. Kuzan won't move Marineford to the New World because that endeavor endeavor was spearheaded by Sakazuki to take the fight to the pirates. And also, this is the part where things start to change quite drastically, which is that there is no global draft. Over the time skip, Sakazuki instituted a mandatory military draft in order to beef up the rather lacking burger bun that was the Marine forces. However, the reason why he did this is because he needed an army to make war in the New World. It was a less than defensive maneuver, and Kuzan, with his motto of lazy justice, would instead consolidate the forces he does have, meaning that neither Fujitora nor Ryukugyu ever joined the Marines, because they were both drafted. Neither of them were going to join if they weren't forced to. Especially Fujitora, who despises the world government with every fiber of his being. He believes them to be the nexus of evil in this world. So much so that I believe he would eventually have joined the Revolutionary Army to fight against them were it not for being drafted. Seriously, the only person who hates the world government more than Fujitora is Dragon himself. Fujitora would swipe right so hard on Dragon that they would go out on some sort of revolutionary date and eventually enter a committed revolutionary relationship. Committed to overthrowing the world government, that is. This is going to have a massive ripple effect down the line. But first, we have a much more immediate problem to solve. Because after Kuzan's promotion, we need at least one new admiral. I say at least one because I think it's more than likely that even after losing, Sakazuki would remain with the Marines. His sense of absolute justice and his belief in this organization are just too strong to simply abandon it in favor of vigilante justice. Because if he did leave to start his own, I don't know what he'd call it, like the Justice Squad, doesn't matter. He would be no better than the pirates and the Revolutionary Army that he hates so much. So Sakazuki will remain as Admiral Akainu, however he will be consistently undermining Fleet Admiral Kuzan at every turn, and likely even develop his own loyalist faction of extremists, sort of like a conservative Dumbledore's army, or for an actual One Piece reference, a variation of Sword, a segment of secret justice agents led by Akainu to skew the world to their agenda. But that does make our job slightly easier because it means we only need to fill one admiral position. Again, no global draft means that Fujitora and Ryukugyu are completely off the table. So we're going to be promoting our new admiral directly from the available pool of vice admirals. And there are actually some really good choices in here. John Giant immediately comes to mind as a man who bravely fought against Whitebeard and seems to, for whatever reason, hold a higher position and degree of responsibility than most vice admirals. He was also the first Giant to enlist in the Marines, so thumbs up for Giant representation, even if it was because he was sold as a child slave. That's less than good. However, John Giant is also a pretty hardline justiceman, and because he already has one absolute justicey pain in the ass of an admiral to deal with, as well as Kizaru, who is, 50-50 at best, well, that probably means that Kuzan will be looking for someone much more firmly in his camp. And as luck would have it, there are two people who satisfy that criteria. And they're also both the only characters we know of who were canonically considered to be the next admiral. And that would be Chaton and Momo Usagi, which means Brown Pig and Pink Rabbit respectively. And just as a bit of history on these two, they are actually fan-made characters that Oda loves so much that he decided to incorporate them into One Piece, confirming that they were both in line for the admiral position before Fujitora and Ryukugyu were drafted. This is going to sound ridiculous, but in the absence of other evidence, one of them is going to be our new admiral. So I put it to you guys, and after over 100,000 votes, you all overwhelmingly selected Momo Usagi, which I knew was going to happen. Like, oh, I wonder who my 90% male audience are going to prefer. The old man literally named Pig or the sexy woman. The thing is, that's very much in line with Kuzan's thought process as well. He actually has a bit of a history as a womanizer, calling Nami a quote, sexy lady with big bazongas, and then proceeded to ask her out on a date, like the smooth talker he is. But I do believe that if that choice fell into Kuzan's lap, then he would likely select the person that he would literally prefer to be in his lap. Another dark horse candidate may be Kurouma, because he's another marine who has that prepared animal epithet, Kurouma meaning black horse, which is why I called him a dark horse candidate, because explaining the joke always makes it funnier. But that gets a bit too much into speculation, especially when we have confirmed admiral candidates, so you know what, everyone say hello to Admiral Momo Usagi. For the purposes of this video, we're going to say that she's roughly as powerful as every other admiral. Does that actually help us though? Well, one really tragic aspect of Fleet Admiral Kuzan's reign comes to us in Punk Hazard, because after beating Caesar and Virgo, Smoker is going to be brutally murdered by Doflamingo. The only thing that saved his life here was Kuzan, and in this reality, Kuzan won't be there. He'll be somewhere that's not there, which is going to devastate our Fleet Admiral because Kuzan and Smoker are actually really good friends. In fact, Kuzan was going to give Luffy a message from Smoker on Long Ring Longland, but then instead he went, nah, that's a stupid message. Silly Smoker. Write better messages next time and maybe I'll deliver them. The damage here definitely doesn't stop with just Smoker though. Doflamingo also threatened to murder Smoker's entire horde of Marines, so there goes Tashigi, the rest of the G5 dude guys, and potentially even the Punk Hazard children. That or Doflamingo abducts the kids and turns them into a assorted slaves, as he often does. Either way, Punk Hazard becomes a very, very dark arc, and we are going to enter Dressrosa with some serious motivation to bring down Doflamingo. Speaking of Dressrosa, this will mostly play out as we know. The one big difference is that instead of Fujitora, Admiral Momo Usagi is going to be sent in his place. My reasoning there being that Kuzan is never going to send Akainu on a mission that is sensitive to any sort of civilian life, and Kizaru is, look, he's just not quite trustworthy enough. But being from the same camp of justice as Garp, in fact, Momo Usagi is very much in on Garp's inner circle, just as Kuzan was, but eventually she will either assist or at least not obscure the Luffy Law Alliance in terms of taking down Doflamingo. The Straw Hats will escape as per usual, because even if Momo Usagi tries to apprehend them, the citizens of Dressrosa are going to step in. But you know what's really going to change though? The Reverie. Initially, you may think that we just replace Fujitora with Momo Usagi again, but that is far from the case. Fujitora was only at Marijois because he was banned from marine bases, and furthermore, Ryukuki was only on Marijois to get Fujitora to go away and actually do his job. So in this timeline, we have a situation where there are potentially no admirals present at the Reverie. Or in a bit of a fun twist, Fujitora will still be there, but as part of the Revolutionary Army. Whether he's there or not though, their Kuma mission is going to go far, far smoother this time around without two admirals hampering them. And there's a lot of potential shifts that could happen here because of the lack of chaos. The world government may find it slightly more difficult to murder King Cobra, although I suspect that they were committed to that action no matter what. But the biggest change here is that with no Fujitora, the warlord system isn't abolished. Our Wisteria Tiger organized that entire event in the shadows by speaking with King Cobra and King Riku to form their own ultimate anti-warlord agenda, which has had a big knock-on effect of meaning the Cross Guild is never formed, and very sadly, Buggy does not become an emperor. That's gonna leave us with a big problem to deal with after Wano, but that arc has its own massive changes first. As an isolated arc, it does play out more or less quite straightforwardly, although it's worth noting that Sakazuki originally wanted to invade Wano full force, but was unable to because the Marines were stretched too thin dealing with the Reverie and capturing the warlords, which they didn't capture, but they tried. But look, in this hypothetical, Fleet Admiral Kuzan has the military might available to attack Wano in the hopes of preventing some sort of Big Mom Kaido alliance. In the end, I don't think he chooses to do so though. Sakazuki wanted to do it because he has a raging justice boner, but Kuzan is well aware that he would be marching into completely unknown territory, potentially to face the full might of two emperors, when just 2 years ago they barely prevailed against one emperor with every tactical advantage they could have hoped for. Plus, without a global draft, the Marines may not be quite as beefy as they are right now, so I just cannot see Kuzan invading Wano. What's more interesting though is that Green Bull doesn't show up at the end of Wano. In fact, no admiral does. Because again, Kuzan isn't going to send in Sakazuki on such a sensitive task. Kizaru could be sent, but he's not the type to go rogue like Green Bull did. I imagine that if told, Kizaru will just sit like a good boy and maybe we'll even give him a treat. And then of course Momo Usagi wouldn't do anything stupid either, which means that the vassals never have to fight an admiral. The vassals and Yamato. So Yamato never comes to the realization that Wano still needs protection, and so we quite literally have a new Straw Hat, and Yamato sets sail with the crew to Egghead Island, which is something I was not expecting when I started this hypothetical. The idea that Kuzan winning a fight 2 years ago means that Yamato joins the crew is a wild domino effect. But overall, the world isn't necessarily a better place with Kuzan as Fleet Admiral. In fact, we've experienced more tragedy under his reign than we have with Sakazuki's leadership so far. And the worst part is that absolute justice is still well and truly on the menu, just hidden in the shadows, instead of front and center where we can at least see it and kind of keep track of it. Of course, we still have to see how this final saga plays out. But at the moment, Kuzan losing to Sakazuki may have led to a situation ultimately guiding us towards the greater good. So the next time you see Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, give him a friendly pat on the back and say, "Good job, mate." But maybe stop murdering people now, please. This is every Marine Admiral in One Piece ranked by a man on the internet. To be clear, that's all current admirals, all former admirals, and all candidates to become an admiral, also known as admirals in waiting. And all of the them are going to be ranked according to the following criteria. 1. Justice, which is how well they serve the public. 2. Obedience, which is how well they serve the world government. 3. Leadership, how well they serve as a good example for their assorted subordinates. And 4. Strength, which is how well they serve their opponents a fist through the stomach and or other body parts. Starting with Admiral Kizaru, a man who's never afraid to try new things, but only when it comes to hats. As a child, Borsellino was a fan of big hats. Then in his early youth, he took up beanies, whereas in his 30s, caps became the style at the time. Then in his 40s, Borsellino well and truly miladied himself by favoring the good old fedora, but in his 50s, Kizaru seems to have given up on headwear entirely. For strength, Kizaru has arguably the most powerful devil fruit in the series, because you need to be able to move at whatever this world's non-scientifically accurate version of light speed is just to keep up with him. And even though it's not actual light speed, it's still not an easy task. Pretty damn top tier. In fact, Luffy had to hack his devil fruit and become a literal god just for the privilege of fighting Kizaru to a draw. With leadership, however, Kizaru mostly serves as a source of confusion for his subordinates. He's completely technically inept, as shown when he struggled with the Black Denden Mushi pre-time skip and post-time skip, when 2 years later he still needed the Black Denden Mushi explained to him. Although in the realm of non-canon leadership, he has proved to be quite the inspiration for Billick from Episode of Luffy. So much so that Billick commissioned a 1-to-1 scale portrait of Kizaru to hang in his office. But the way I would most describe Kizaru is neutral. Although the original concept for Kizaru was much more animated. These sketches were drawn well over 15 years ago, and I can't help but feel like Eiichiro Oda practically predicted YouTube, because these are like the faces of a Kizaru reaction channel. I react to the Paramount War. I can't believe Sakazuki just did that, and now I kind of want a donut. Kizaru, to his credit, is pretty obedient though. The only mark against him in this area was very recently, when he rejected Saint Saturn's more straightforward plan to invade Egghead Island due to feeling a sense of honor in regards to an old friend. But when it comes to justice, Kizaru is a pretty unfortunate coin flip, because his personal motto is unclear or uncertain justice, and you could even translate the original Japanese to something more along the lines of gray area or non-committal. So not necessarily the most comforting for the public, but still a very good boy, and that is the exact tier that we're throwing him into. Moving on to Kuzan, we have another absurdly powerful man. In fact, the only fight Kuzan has ever lost was against another admiral on Punk Hazard, and the only fight he's ever come close to losing was against an admiral candidate on Hachinosu, both of which are acceptable because they're in-house problems, as long as you're not losing to people below admiral level. Those two aside, no character in this series has ever come close to causing a problem for Kuzan. His very presence made Doflamingo retreat, then Kuzan quite casually strolled into Whole Cake Island and beat a sweet commander so quickly that Oda didn't even have time to show anything but Charlotte Cracker's pathetic frozen biscuit body. And Kuzan would be very much on track for the same tier as Kizaru, if not for the one teeny tiny problem, which is his outright resignation of the admiral position and betrayal of the world government, so that he could go and pledge his allegiance to an emperor of the sea. In terms of obedience, that's not even a 0. We're looking at minus points here, which also greatly impacts his leadership score, because he certainly isn't setting a good example for the Marines under him. And even when he was a Marine, Kuzan wasn't exactly the most obedient, because he did allow Nico Robin to escape not once, not twice, but thrice. And when it comes to justice, like what even is his justice anymore? It used to be lazy justice, but nowadays he's anything but lazy, but not lazy, but active in all of the wrong ways. Kuzan is more active as a member of the Blackbeard Pirates than he ever was as a Marine Admiral, which makes this Admiral tier list a little bit awkward, because he now represents the exact antithesis of what we're looking for. But still, we do need to recognize his service and his strength, so Kuzan gets a solid "you tried." But also, you didn't try hard enough, unlike this guy. Sengoku the Buddha was born for leadership. As a child, he was an overachiever, constantly winning calligraphy contests, as well as having attained a black belt before having attained puberty. In terms of strength, Sengoku is an often neglected legend. The Pirate King Goldie Roger himself often equates Sengoku directly to Garp, thus crediting Sengoku as one of 2 Marines that could entertain him. Plus, Whitebeard shows an uncharacteristic level of respect towards Sengoku, which should tell you a lot, because respect isn't even something that Shanks was able to earn from Whitebeard. As for obedience, Sengoku is a very by-the-book Marineman. He will carry out any orders given to him in an exceptional manner. However, by far the most impressive aspect of Sengoku is his sense of justice. In a way that no other admiral has ever done, Sengoku was able to balance his duty to the world government with his duty to the people, with a particular degree of empathy that seems terrifyingly lacking from most admirals. But Sengoku still retained enough fierceness to build up a John Wick-style reputation amongst pirates, as we can see from Bartolomeu's mental image of Sengoku as a big, scary, evil monster man. So what more could you want? He inspires loyalty in his subordinates, he inspires fear in his enemies, and generally Sengoku gets the job done without being too much of a prick. Sengoku is the kind of man who's going to have a bunch of scholarships and buildings named after him once he dies, such as the Fleet Admiral Sengoku Center for kids who can't read good. And as for Sengoku, he's simply too good of an admiral, and that's why he shall transcend into the Fleet Admiral tier. Being too good is a rare problem though. Usually it's the opposite, it's the not that. For example, after the Paramount War, the Marines had a bit of an admiral issue, because due to 1 promotion and 1 resignation, 2 admiral spots became vacant at the same time. And were it not for the global draft, our next candidate, Momo Usagi, would have been selected as a new admiral. How do we know this? Because Oda said so. But also because Momo Usagi was given a preemptive codename. Her real name is Gion, and Momo Usagi means pink rabbit. All of the admirals are given a special codename combining a color and an animal. Kizaru, for example, means yellow monkey. Ki meaning yellow, and Zaru meaning monkey, which is actually Saru, but due to Rendaku, the Saru becomes Zaru. It's a thing in Japanese, don't you worry about it. But having a codename essentially makes Momo Usagi an admiral in waiting. And she's not the only one either. There are 2 other admirals in waiting that we'll explore in this video in a bit, but this means that as far as the world government is concerned, Momo Usagi is what I would describe as adequate. Because if she's even being considered at all, then that means that strength isn't a question. And according to volume 777, one of her most devastating attacks is her, quote, seductive hospitality. So pirates aren't afraid of her, and that's the problem. They really should be, because we have a Boa Hancock light effect happening here. She also appears to have a bit of an edgy side to her. Due to that, there's spider tattoo on her thigh, which makes her look like she used to be a member of the Phantom Troop. Seriously, the spider tattoo design is unbelievably close to the ones used in Hunter x Hunter. But Momo Usagi is a perfectly mid-admiral. Decent justice, solid obedience, standard meeting power, and all in all, she is perfectly acceptable, albeit not exceptional. Moving along the color wheel from pink to purple, we land at Fujitora, who almost certainly took Momo Usagi's admiral position, but it's not difficult to see why. When it comes to raw power, this man controls gravity and has the ability to pull meteors from space in order to collide with his very unfortunate enemies. And that's if said enemies can even move under the pressure of being crushed by all of the gravities. And despite only having been a Marine for at most 2 years, Fujitora has proved to be an exceptionally capable leader. His subordinates trust and obey him without question, but where Fujitora is a little bit lacking is in regards to his own obedience. Even though he's a Marine admiral, Fujitora holds zero allegiance to the world government and is in fact only working for them in order to further his own personal agenda, which he succeeded in as he was the mastermind behind the dissolution of the warlord system. His sense of justice is well and truly in favor of the people. In fact, I would say that of all of the admirals, Fujitora is the one least willing to compromise innocent lives, if he's willing to compromise at all. And he's even willing to directly disobey the fleet admiral and the 5 elder stars. Which is probably why, of the 3 current admirals, Fujitora is the most popular according to both the 6th and 7th popularity polls. In fact, in the World Top 100, Fujitora ended up exactly 1 place above the current fleet admiral, which is just what you get for being a bit of a dick, Sakazuki. But with that said, Fujitora is not the perfect admiral because his obedience is next to non-existent, so we're going to call him a very good boy and move on. To conclude the trio of our pinkish purpley admirals, here is Zephyr from One Piece film Z. A non-canon admiral, but one we should discuss because it's a pretty bold maneuver to make a non-canon admiral, especially given how each and every one of them has such a large impact on the world. In retrospect, Zephyr actually foreshadows Kuzan a bit because Zephyr left the Marines due to general dissatisfaction with their practices and started his own revolutionary naval force. And in film Z, Kuzan is one of Zephyr's prized pupils, so in a way this non-canon film predicted Kuzan's antagonistic switch. However, everything else about Zephyr is completely disappointing. With strength, Zephyr became an admiral at the age of 38 and resigned from his position also at the age of 38. This is primarily due to the mental anguish of his wife and son being murdered, fair enough, but later on he was defeated and his arm was severed by a future warlord of the sea. So in terms of who that is, all we know is that it was one of the warlords who joined during the time skip. So the only possible candidates are Trafalgar Law, Edward Weevil, and I guess technically Buggy. I'd like to think it was Buggy. But also none of them fit very cleanly and the film never intended on answering that question, but the point is that Zephyr lost to a warlord, which is not a very admirally thing to do. He did also betray the Marines, actively declare war against the world government, and try to, checks notes, blow up the entirety of the New World, which contains a lot of innocent civilians. So as much as I love Film Z, Zephyr is not the admiral we're looking for, and due to his non-canonicity, we're going to throw him into the not even an admiral tier. Alright, pig time now! Oink oink everyone, it's Chaton, aka the brown pig. Another of the admirals in waiting, but this man is not to be underestimated. He may look like a joke, he may sound like a joke, he may literally be a joke, but the world government considered him powerful enough to plonk him in the admiral succession line. To be clear, he is a joke though, so is Momo Usagi, because both of these characters were actually created by fans in the SBS segments of manga volumes. Back before Green Bull was introduced, fans were speculating on who the final admiral would be and offering Oda some very helpful suggestions, like Pink Rabbit and Brown Pig, both of whom Oda loved so much that they got turned into actual characters. And not just that, but genuinely powerful and influential characters. And ever since then, they both get referenced whenever the opportunity arises, with my favorite cameo being Chaton playing golf in One Piece film Gold, surrounded by attractive women, because he's something of a ladies' man. And our brown pig has an entire subplot where he's trying to ask Momo Usagi out on a date, but she keeps rejecting him. But for the sake of this video, Chaton is a perfectly acceptable admiral. To our newest admiral now, Ryokugyu, or Green Bull, was another one of the vacancies filled during the time skip, meaning that this man is considered so much more goodlier than Momo Usagi and Chaton that he was fast-tracked to the admiral position. And honestly, I think the lack of experience is much more evident with Green Bull than it was with Fujitora, because for power, sure, I can't fault Green Bull at all. Like all of the admirals, his abilities are quite series-breaking, but his main issue is obedience, leadership, and justice, aka everything else. On the one hand, Aramaki will do everything he can to please Fleet Admiral Sakazuki Senpai, so that's nice, but sometimes that means he takes a bit too much of the old initiative and ends up placing himself in a compromised position. Like on Wano, for example, where Green Bull found himself all alone and at the complete mercy of Shanks. In regards to justice of all of the admirals, Green Bull is the one that I would personally want defending me the least. He really doesn't care at all for the lives of those around him, and as a leader, he is sorely lacking. At the moment, Green Bull's position is held up by power alone, but at least he sometimes does what he's told, so look, he's acceptable. For someone exceptional, however, we move to Commander-in-Chief Kong, and it's been an awfully long time since this man was an admiral, but he's what I would describe as a mix of Sengoku and Garp. This is what happens when we combine Garp's raw strength with Sengoku's raw tolerance for administration. There's a reason why Kong, of all people, is currently the highest ranking human within the world government. He ticks all of the boxes, probably quite literally these days due to all of the paperwork. So he's going to rise above into the Fleet Admiral tier. Now here's a dark horse candidate, mostly because that's what Kurouma's codename means, Black Horse. He's a very interesting guy though, because while it's never been outright stated, Kurouma was almost certainly an admiral candidate alongside Momo Usagi and Chaton. Not only does he have a code name, but his design is also based on real-life Japanese actor Akira Kobayashi, and almost every admiral in One Piece is modeled directly after a Japanese actor, even the joke ones. Momo Usagi is based on Michio Kogure, and Chaton takes inspiration from Kiyoshi Atsume. The most curious part though is that Kurouma isn't even a vice admiral. His role is the director of Marine Criminal Investigative Services, so less punch fighting and more intelligence gathering. However, in the one and only scene he's been featured in thus far, he is very much painted as being on equal footing to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki and Admiral Kizaru. They don't speak to Kurouma like he's a subordinate, so there's quite a large degree of respect happening here. So Kurouma, like his fellow admirals in waiting, is going to end up in the acceptable tier. But next is the admiral candidate. Someone who the world government practically begged to become an admiral, but always refused the promotion. Monkey D. Garp's strength and leadership is unquestionable. However, his justice at times can lean a bit on the complacent side, and his obedience is even worse. In fact, thinking about it, it's very rare to see Garp actually carry out a direct order. He mostly acts as a one-man army, administering his own justice with the backing of the world government. He only went to God Valley because Roger was there. He only set sail to the Ed War because, again, Roger was there. And he was the one who made the decision to go to Hachinosu to rescue Kobe. Off the top of my head, I'm really struggling to find an example where Garp actually obeyed an order. But even though he was never technically an admiral, spiritually, he is very much an even greater figurehead within the Marines. It's just the obedience we're lacking, so Garp is a very good boy. But whilst Garp is probably the ideal leader from the people's perspective, Sakazuki is the ideal leader from the world government's perspective. Unquestionably loyal, mercilessly effective, and has the power needed to make anything a reality, such as loyalty. Because Sakazuki is not the greatest leader on this list. He doesn't inspire people so much as threaten them. But at the same time, when it comes down to a war, I would be feeling much more comfortable fighting on Sakazuki's side than I would be fighting against him. But just in case you were curious about his penis, and I know you were, in volume 66, one reader relentlessly asked Oda if Sakazuki's penis was magma. Then before Oda had time to answer, the reader asked if Kuzan's was made of ice, and again before Oda could answer, he asked if Kizaru's was made out of light. And Oda was so taken aback by all of these shocking questions, but then went on to confirm that the answer is yes to all of them. So look, Sakazuki, he's not the perfect leader, but he does have a magma penis. And when it comes down to what really defines an admiral, it's hard not to see Sakazuki as the epitome of the role. And hey, maybe that role isn't always good, maybe it's not even mostly good, but that's an issue within the system as a whole. And I hear there's a whole revolutionary army currently working on patching that, but Sakazuki will also transcend into the Fleet Admiral tier. And that's every admiral in One Piece ranked by a man on the internet. And next up, you can click this video for another hit of your degenerate fictional pirate addiction.